Chapter 31-35. The direction of cultivation was also all-encompassing in all aspects. Even if it was just an abstract direction, there were still countless points that could be researched. Thus, these supreme transcendents didn't need to worry that their interactions would become meaningless. On the contrary, not having to interact with specific concepts meant that they didn't need to worry about minor disturbances. Indeed, their interactions became even more efficient. In addition, they obtained bits and pieces of information from the interactions between the supreme transcendents at the sixth tribulation level. This made the progress of these supreme transcendents quite obvious. Very quickly, in less than tens of thousands of years, a general cultivation system was sorted out by them. This specific cultivation system didn't involve concepts. Although concepts were unimaginably important in cultivation, due to the relative independence of each concept, they had no choice but to eliminate this incomparably important factor. In the end, in this cultivation system, they directly treated the sixth tribulation level as the next great realm for their cultivation. However, they had also come into contact with the transcendent experts of the sixth tribulation level before, and they knew how great the gap between them and the sixth tribulation experts was. They understood that it was nearly impossible to reach the sixth tribulation level in a single step. Since it was impossible to reach the heavens in a single step, there was only one way: to construct an indefinite number of traps between these two realms. In fact, what these transcendent experts have been trying to determine over the years was how many levels there were between the two realms. At first, some supreme transcendents thought that it would take tens of thousands of levels, while others thought that it would take thousands of levels. Some even thought that it would take hundreds of levels. In fact, even those who thought that it would take at least 33 levels. However, after coming into contact with those six tribulation experts and interacting with each other, their understanding of the six tribulation experts became deeper and deeper. This allowed them to have a deeper understanding of the difference between them and the sixth tribulation level. In this way, after tens of thousands of years of communication, they finally confirmed one thing. The number of sets they needed to fight against a sixth tribulation expert at their current realm was at least 5 levels. From this point of view, the moment they set foot on the 5th level would be the moment they would become the 6th level experts. From a certain perspective, the results of their interactions were quite remarkable. Although it was different from the real situation, they had come in contact with the truth from another angle, or it could even be said that they had come in contact with it from another direction. But this was also to be expected. None of these cultivators who were able to open up a path of transcendence from despair were simple cultivators. Their understanding of cultivation and the improvement of the essence of life was not something that ordinary cultivators could compare with. Although the sixth tribulation level experts stood higher than them, that was only because the sixth tribulation level experts had come into contact with things that ordinary cultivators couldn't compare to. If the sixth tribulation level experts were placed in the same environment as the supreme transcendents, then the supreme transcendents wouldn't be any weaker than the sixth tribulation level experts. Under these circumstances, and with all sorts of traces, it wasn't surprising that they were able to discover the true gap between realms. Although there was still an unimaginably long way to cross this gap, at least they could see the direction and hope. In the following period of time, the supreme transcendents began to use their own methods to explore in the opposite direction, searching for a fulcrum that could support them further, trying to find a way to set foot on the 5th level. However, it was clear that this wasn't an easy task. At the very least, in the current environment, this was a nearly impossible task. Time slowly passed, and before they knew it, 10 billion years had passed. After 10 billion years of development, the supreme transcendence had truly become the absolute mainstream of the many island branches. All sorts of methods to transcend the world had already been summarized, becoming common knowledge in the various island branches of the land of no family. At this point, transcendence was no longer something that depended on luck. Over the past 10 billion years, many methods of transcending the world had been discovered. How to find the most suitable method of transcending the world for oneself, how to modify the method of transcending the world for oneself, and so on had become a fixed subject. Any cultivator who wanted to transcend the world could find the most perfect method of transcending the world for himself through this subject. This minimized the risk of transcendence. At the same time, because the study of transcendence had become so deep, the current transcendence was no longer the same as before, where anyone could transcend if they wanted to. Because the appearance of every supreme transcendent would cause some sort of damage to the world. After 10 billion years of research, in order to prevent the world from suffering unbearable damage, the unattached lands now knew exactly what frequency of transcendence should be used to minimize the damage to the world. How large must the scale of transcendence be in order to achieve a state of balance between the world and oneself? As a result, most of the worlds now had organizations that were qualified to manage the world's transcendence. Any cultivator who wanted to transcend the world had to first apply to this organization, and it would coordinate with them. Only after obtaining the right to transcend the world could they attempt to transcend the world. For the unattached lands, the emergence of this organization was practically a leap in civilization. It allowed the development of the unattached lands to become more orderly and stable. Of course, the establishment of this organization had not been smooth sailing. The organization had first appeared in one of the worlds, but after its establishment, it had not received the approval of the cultivators who wanted to transcend. After all, I'm going to transcend with everything I care about. So who cares about your world? Moreover, after I transcend, what can your organization, which is limited to this world, do to me? Since they did not care about the state of the world, and the organization did not have the ability to restrict them, how could they pay attention to an organization of supreme transcendence established in one of the worlds? In the end, the organization of supreme transcendence could only be established because, as the number of supreme transcendence increased, the communication channels between the unattached lands became incomparably smooth. Because the communication channel became incomparably smooth, from a certain point of view, the unattached land had already become one. The fates of different worlds were not completely linked, but they were intimately connected. For example, if a disaster with boundless poison appeared in a certain world, it could easily be transmitted to other worlds through this communication channel. For example, if a new technology appeared in a certain world that could bring about certain benefits to the world, it could easily be transmitted to other unattached lands. Under these circumstances, the appearance of an organization of supreme transcendence, which was of great significance to the world, was naturally recognized by many worlds, receiving the support of the unattached lands. In the end, this organization, which had only appeared because of a certain cultivator's sense of responsibility, became a behemoth that spanned across the unattached lands. Many worlds supported each other, and there were even a large number of transcendents participating, forming a deterrent force towards those who attempted to transcend in almost every aspect. Before the entire world transcended, the members of the organization in the world could deter the cultivators who attempted to transcend. Once the cultivator successfully transcended and became a supreme transcendent, the other supreme transcendents in the unattached lands could also act as a deterrent. Although supreme transcendents could not directly interact with each other with their true bodies, the exchange of information was enough to accomplish many things. It was not that they could not act as a deterrent without their true bodies entering other worlds. As for how to act as a deterrent, it was a relatively simple matter. For example, they could process information and turn it into a book of information that could distort and pollute information. They could also send information beings over, and so on. It was extremely difficult for a single supreme transcendent to deal with another supreme transcendent. Even after a great deal of effort, the other party's development would only slow down. However, if the number of supreme transcendents was not a single person, but multiple, the situation would be different. As long as 10 supreme transcendents acted at the same time, it would be enough to cause the development of one supreme transcendence world to stagnate. And if more than 10 supreme transcendents acted at the same time, it would only be a matter of time before that supreme transcendence world or land began to degenerate. Afterward, as the number of supreme transcendents increased, the resulting attack would become stronger. When more than 100 supreme transcendents acted, it would be enough to cause the world or land of a supreme transcendent to fall into the apocalypse. Thus, even if their true bodies could not cross the unattached lands and enter other worlds, the existence of supreme transcendents would still be a great deterrent to those who came after them. And how many supreme transcendents were there in this organization that had grown to the point of crossing the unattached lands? Almost all of them. In other words, almost all the transcendents in the world were members of this management organization. Of course, this was not because all supreme transcendents were aware of this. Rather, as the organization grew larger and larger, if one did not join, one would become the target of public criticism. One's benefits would no longer be guaranteed. Thus, even if they did not have the sense of responsibility to treat the unattached lands as their home, even if it was to ensure that they did not become a minority, they had no choice but to join the organization. With so many supreme transcendents joining this organization, it was too easy to find more than 100 supreme transcendents who were intent on punishing those who violated the organization's rules. Therefore, even those who had transcended would still be greatly deterred after they had transcended and reached the heavenly Tao. It was precisely because of this omnipresent deterrence that the rules set by the organization became the fundamental rules of the land of no family, making the land of no family even more orderly and stable. In the past 10 billion years ago, there would occasionally be a world that would fall silent due to too many supreme transcendents, and it would take a long time for it to recover. But now, even if supreme transcendents continued to emerge from the unattached lands and join the family of supreme transcendents, there were very few worlds in the unattached lands that would fall silent because of this. After such a long period of development, the number of supreme transcendents in the unattached lands had already surpassed 10 billion. This number far surpassed the number of sixth tribulation experts and became the main body of supreme transcendents. Because of the increase in their numbers, they were more confident in dealing with the transcendent experts of the sixth rank. At the very least, when facing the sixth-level supreme transcendents, they dared to try to infiltrate the circle of the sixth-level supreme transcendents. However, it was clear that this infiltration was meaningless to the sixth-level supreme transcendents. Even if their numbers were much lesser than the average transcendent transcending expert, their strength was still much stronger than the average transcendent transcending expert. This difference in strength allowed them to disregard the average supreme transcendents. Moreover, the goal of the sixth-level supreme transcendents was fundamentally different from that of the average supreme transcendents. The goal of those who had transcended all over the world was to find the next step, so that they could step into the sixth tribulation expert level. But for the sixth-level supreme transcendents, their goal was to wait for the island branch to grow to a certain limit, and once again let them experience the inconceivably grand interaction between the island branch and the ocean of nothingness in the outside world. Everything else was just preparation for this kind of interaction. Whether it was now that they had become supreme transcendents, communicating with each other in the unattached lands, or constantly working hard to expand the size of the island branch, they were all preparations for this goal. This difference in goals meant that the interaction between the two circles was close to zero. Chapter 31-36. While these changes were happening to the island branches, in that mysterious place that seemed to be far above the many island branches, Luo Fan had entered a state of indescribable stillness. At this moment, his entire body and mind had fused with the many island branches. At the very least, this was his entire body and mind. In this process of fusion, he seemed to have become the many island branches. Everything in these island branches and all living beings were like the basic units of his body. Although everything that happened was different, as a whole, it directly merged into a complete him, the true him. In the past, when there were not so many transcendents, this feeling had existed, but it had never been as complete as it was now. The feeling of the countless island branches becoming the basic units of his body and mind was more like an abstract feeling, as if an ordinary person would feel that the clothes on his body were a part of him. For the average person, they would not distinguish the clothes they were wearing from themselves when they were in a situation like this. Once they put on the clothes, they would naturally feel that their body and the clothes they were wearing were themselves. But clearly, although there was such a feeling, in reality, the clothes were still the clothes, and the person was still the person. In the end, the two were not one. In the past, for Luo Fan, the island branches were like the clothes he was wearing. Although he felt that he had become one with these island branches, they had become an important part of his body and mind. But in reality, these island branches were still island branches, and the world in these island branches was still the world. There was still a barrier between them and his body and mind that was difficult to cross. It was like a person's clothes. When you wore them, you naturally felt that they were one with you. But clothes were still clothes. If you took them off, they were just a pile of cloth. But now, after the number of transcendents had increased to this level, this situation had clearly changed. Now, these island branches, these world, were no longer just clothes that had fused with him. Now, they had all become cells in his body, an incomparably important part of his body and mind. It was like the clothes had become his skin. With this deeper fusion, Luo Fan felt that the communication between the island branches and the void behind them was more than 100 times clearer. Moreover, he did not need to read this communication to know. Now, it was as if this communication was happening between him and the void behind him. It was as if it was not the island branches or the world in these island branches that were communicating with the surrounding void, but he himself was communicating with the surrounding void. In this state, he no longer had the mind to pay attention to any developments in his island branches. Even if the 6 tribulation experts had become transcendents, even if they had established huge organizations, even if they had directly seized the authority to manage the transcendents, it was the same. From the moment he entered this state, everything was equivalent to the interaction between the various parts of his body and mind. Clearly, unless there was a problem with his descent, very few people would be interested in the interaction between the various parts of his body. In this state, the current Luo Fan looked like he had transformed into the countless island branches of the supreme heavenly Tao. It was just that he was subconsciously controlling all the changes in the island branches. This state made his control much more rigid and inflexible than before. However, at the same time, after this change, the many island branches and unattached lands would also become more stable, and it would be harder for any abnormal changes to occur. This was clearly a good thing for all the living beings in the island branches. The reason why the increase in the number of transcendents would cause this change was actually not complicated. It was because the appearance of the transcendents had built a large number of communication channels between the island branches. These communication channels were a way for the transcendents to communicate with each other. It was even where their hopes of advancing further in their cultivation lay. However, for these island branches, the appearance of these communication channels was like blood vessels that connected the many island branches even more tightly. These island branches had originally branched out layer by layer from the same island, and they themselves already had a rather close and fundamental connection. However, this connection only existed at the root, in the depths of these island branches. If one compared them to ordinary objects, these branches were more like countless seedlings on a tree or countless branches and leaves. Such a situation also made these islands look like an inseparable whole from a more macro perspective. However, this could only be seen from a broader perspective. From a normal point of view, the connection between the many island branches was still too weak. It was precisely because this connection was too weak that Luo Fan had previously felt that these island branches had already fused with him, but there was still a layer of separation in the end. He had only treated them as something like clothes. However, the situation now was clearly different. With the appearance of the communication channels between the many transcendents, they had paid a huge price to barely strengthen this originally weak connection. Through the strengthening of this connection, these island branches finally completely fused with Luo Fan, allowing him to evolve from clothes to skin. In this inexplicable state of mind and body, Luo Fan felt that his body was improving at every moment. The connection between his body and the nothingness of the outside world was also strengthening at every moment. The difference between the scale of communication between his body and the nothingness of the various heavens and himself was becoming smaller and smaller. Of course, in terms of the standard of communication between the various heavens and the nothingness, this gap was still quite shocking, but it was not that easy to overcome. However, even though the gap was still very large, it was still constantly shrinking. For Luo Fan, this feeling was still quite wonderful. Just as these earth-shattering changes were happening in the many island branches, the many six tribulation powerhouses who were originally waiting for an opportunity to enter the island branches gradually felt that the island branches in front of them seemed to have become more dangerous, but also more tempting. This feeling was so wonderful that it made the many six tribulation powerhouses feel rather uneasy. If these six tribulation powerhouses were all in their true bodies, many of them would have turned around and left. After all, although they could feel that the secrets contained in these island branches seemed to have increased by a lot, the opportunities that they could bring to them also seemed to have increased by a lot. However, the sense of danger that was constantly eroding them had also increased by a lot. If the sense of danger in the past was only limited to the possibility that the island branches might delay their cultivation, then the sense of danger now was already a feeling that their lives were in danger. In other words, in the past, the senses of the six tribulation powerhouses told them that if they entered the island branches to explore, they might be trapped and their cultivation would be delayed. However, now, their senses told them that if they entered the island branches to explore, not only would they be trapped, but they might even lose their lives. With this sense of danger, no matter how much they desired to improve themselves, it was impossible for them to easily make up their minds to enter. After all, this was not their only hope to improve. However, it was obvious that this situation did not occur. None of the sixth tribulation powerhouses here were in their true bodies. They were either clones, incarnations, or projections. Some were even just puppets. Under such circumstances, their ability to withstand danger was obviously many times stronger than their true bodies. With this unimaginable ability to withstand danger, how could they easily give up on the island branches that had clearly become more tempting and the opportunities within them seemed to have become stronger? As a result, the number of six tribulation powerhouses around the island branches had increased at some point. However, the six tribulation powerhouses who had their connection with their incarnations severed because they offended Luo Fan were not among them. When they sensed that the island branches had begun to change, they had already left one by one. Now, this sense of danger had increased to the extent that it could bring danger to the lives of six tribulation powerhouses. How could they still stay here? God knows how long he had been cultivating in his down notes. Although it was a little dangerous and a pity to give up on his incarnation and not take it back. However, this kind of danger and pity seemed insignificant compared to the sense of danger that the island branches gave him. Unknowingly, there were already a large number of six tribulation powerhouses surrounding the island branches in the back layer of nothingness. Looking at the density of the six tribulation powerhouses, it was not much worse than the six tribulation powerhouses around the countless worlds of laws in the back layer of nothingness. If there was an essential difference, it would probably be that the six tribulation powerhouses around the countless worlds of laws had too many repetitions, while the six tribulation powerhouses around the island branches didn't have many repetitions. Of course, it couldn't be said that the attraction of these island branches to the six tribulation powerhouses had increased to the point that they were not any worse than the worlds of laws. The reason why the liveliness outside looked so similar was because the worlds of laws didn't restrict living beings from entering, but these island branches restricted cultivators from entering most of the time. In other words, Although the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses around the worlds of laws seemed to be similar to the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses in these island branches, it was only because more 6 tribulation powerhouses had already stepped into the worlds of laws to contribute to Luo fans' cultivation. Of course, this was obviously only temporary. Although the attraction of these island branches couldn't be compared to the worlds of laws, it was only temporary. After all, the flow of time in these island branches was simply too fast. With such a fast flow of time, the development of these island branches would also be unimaginably fast. With such an unimaginable speed of development, one day, the level of these island branches would eventually catch up to the worlds of laws. And once their level caught up, the attraction of the 6 tribulation powerhouses would naturally catch up to the worlds of laws. At this time, there were even many 6 tribulation powerhouses secretly guessing which of the two was stronger in the end. They even began to wonder if the existence behind the island branches had some kind of contradiction with the existence behind the worlds of laws. At this point, no matter how stupid they were, they had already guessed that the existence behind the island branches and the worlds of laws were at least 7 tribulation powerhouses. 2 different 7 tribulation powerhouses had appeared on the 6th floor of the Down Masters Road at the same time and were cultivating in such a similar way. No matter who it was, they would link the two together. As for why they guessed that this connection was not complementary, but contradictory, the reason was even simpler. After all, their appearances were so similar. Wasn't this the reason why the 6 tribulation powerhouses had to make a choice? This was actually not a good thing for both of them. If they were separated by time, and there was only one special hesitation at the same time, the attraction to the 6 tribulation powerhouses would obviously become stronger. In that case, the benefits that each special hesitation could get would of course be greater. It was precisely because of this idea that they guessed that there might be contradictions between the existences above the 7 tribulation powerhouses behind the two. However, it was obvious that they had not guessed that the same expert behind the two was Luo Fan. In fact, if there were really 2 different existences, their way of thinking would naturally be correct. However, if that was not the case, according to Luo Fan's current method, it would actually be more beneficial for him. Chapter 31-37. Although the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by these 2 existences at the same time would be much less than the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by each of them individually. However, if one were to look at the total number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by these 2 existences, the number would obviously be much more than the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by each of them individually. In this way, there was no need to say more about what to do to benefit Luo Fan the most. If these 2 existences were to be pushed out individually, the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses he would attract would obviously be much less. And if these 2 existences were to be pushed out at the same time, the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by each unit of time would obviously be much more than the former. In this way, if the total number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by each region was calculated, the total number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by the latter would obviously be more. Looking at a fixed period of time, if they were to be pushed out individually, the fairest way would be to evenly divide this period of time into 2 sections. One of the sections was the branch of the island, and the other was the projection of the world. In this way, the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by the first section and the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by the second section would add up to a huge number. And if these 2 regions were to be pushed out at the same time, there was no need to divide this period of time into sections at all. This period of time would be directly treated as a whole. And in this way, the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by the branch of the island and the projection of the world would obviously be more than the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by a single region. In this way, after repeating this unit of time to this fixed period of time, the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses attracted by it would naturally be much more than when they were separated. This kind of judgment was actually not difficult. As long as one knew that there was the same existence behind these 2, not to mention those 6 tribulation powerhouses. Even an ordinary person with a bit of rationality would be able to make this judgment. However, it was a pity that these 6 tribulation powerhouses did not know that there was the same existence behind these two. Therefore, they could not make this simple deduction. Another few breaths passed. The branch of the island changed again. The difference in the flow of time inside the branch of the island and the outside world was really too great. A few breaths outside were equivalent to hundreds of millions of years inside. After such a long period of time, the internal development of the island branch had been so smooth. There was no need to say what the result would be. In just a few breaths of time, the island branches had become complete, and it was time for them to branch out again. The island branches began to flicker with an indescribable brilliance. Immediately after, the originally sealed paths for 6 tribulation experts to enter those islands were once again opened up. The clones, incarnations, projections, and even puppets of the 6 tribulation experts had already made all preparations under the urging of their main bodies. At this moment, even though the island branches were about to change, and the risk was much greater than usual, they couldn't resist the orders of their main bodies and charged into the island branches. In the blink of an eye, the void around these islands became empty. Although not every 6 tribulation expert charged into the island branch, 99% of them clearly did. The remaining 6 tribulation experts, clones, incarnations, projections, and the like were the ones who suddenly had some unexpected changes. Once there were a lot of people, it was naturally impossible for everything to go smoothly. Accidents were bound to happen. Perhaps their power was suddenly thwarted, or their mind was thwarted, or they were disturbed by other 6 tribulation experts, or maybe their main bodies suddenly changed their minds. There were only a few 6 tribulation experts left. They frowned and looked around, as if they were reconsidering what to do. Obviously, there would be such 6 tribulation experts every time. Even if they did anything, there would be such existences. Sometimes, because of such accidents, they would obtain unexpected benefits and avoid unexpected dangers. But most of the time, such existences were unlucky and missed out on opportunities. For those 6 tribulation experts who didn't enter the island branch together as they did before, those who successfully entered the island branch were inexplicably shocked at this time. It wasn't because the first layer of the island branch they entered was quite special. If the world was special, no matter how special it was, it wouldn't be surprising for these 6 tribulation experts. After all, the heaven and earth, world, space-time, universe, and even the level of the Tao Master that they had seen were already beyond the imagination of ordinary cultivators. For them, they were already tired of seeing any kind of heaven and earth. If it was just the abnormality of the heaven and earth, it would only surprise and amaze them. At most, they would just praise it, but it would never make them feel shocked. At this time, the source of their shock was not the heaven and earth itself, but the information contained in the heaven and earth when they all entered the first layer of the island branch. As 6 tribulation experts, they didn't enter these island branches to do hard labor. Even if they had to do hard labor in exchange for benefits in the end, they wouldn't use this goal as a guideline before they were really forced to that extent. They entered these island branches in order to thoroughly understand the mysteries contained in these islands and find the secrets contained in these island branches that were beneficial to their cultivation and benefit them. Under such circumstances, when they entered this island branch and stepped into the first layer of the island branch, the first thing they did was, of course, to feel and understand the heaven and earth. Therefore, at this moment, they would immediately start to sense the information contained in this world and experience the various subtle secrets that might exist in the depths of this world. And it was this behavior that made them feel indescribably shocked. At this moment, they seemed to be connected to an indescribably great sense, as if they were absorbing endless nutrients from the endless mysterious existences around them at every moment. At every moment, they could feel that they understood all kinds of mysteries that they couldn't understand before, and they knew countless truths that they didn't know before. These mysteries and truths were so profound and mysterious. In the process of absorbing these truths and mysteries, They felt that their cultivation realm seemed to begin to accumulate some kind of inexplicable power and began to attack the cultivation bottleneck that they had encountered before. How is this possible? Is a seventh tribulation expert really so much stronger than a sixth tribulation expert? This was the thought that came to the minds of those six tribulation experts. At this time, the incredible changes in the world that they had entered had far exceeded their imagination. They could naturally obtain endless benefits just by being in it, and the characteristics that could allow their cultivation realm to rise endlessly was something that they didn't even dare to think about before. To be able to do this, to be able to open up such an incredible world, the brilliance of the existence's means was far beyond the limits of their imagination. And what kind of existence was the creator of all this? It was an unknown existence that they suspected to be a seventh tribulation expert. How could they not be shocked by the brilliance of the seventh tribulation expert's means? At this time, even some sixth tribulation experts began to suspect that the existence behind this island branch was not only a seventh tribulation expert, but also an eighth tribulation expert. Only in this way could they understand the inconceivable ability he had displayed. There seems to be a layer. At this time, in different branches of the island, some six tribulation experts discovered this point one after another. Although they could feel the indescribable information constantly pouring into their minds, this information still seemed to be separated by a layer. Although it could allow them to obtain great benefits, it felt like it was separated by a layer of glass. Looking at something through a layer of glass could indeed enhance one's understanding of that thing. However, a layer of separation was still a layer of separation. No matter how much this kind of understanding was enhanced, it would obviously be missing an important link such as taste, touch, and so on. At this time, this was what those six tribulation experts felt. The information that kept pouring and did indeed bring them a lot of benefits, making them feel that their cultivation realm was rising bit by bit. But in the end, they still felt like they were scratching an itch through their boots, as if something was missing no matter what. This feeling made many six tribulation experts feel quite annoyed. What should we do? This question kept lingering in their hearts. It should be known that for them, it was fine if they didn't know they could obtain benefits. Now that they knew they could obtain benefits, and that this benefit was separated by a layer due to certain circumstances, how could they accept it? Therefore, at this time, they naturally wanted to break this shackle and dig out all the benefits. Transcending the world. Soon, they found a possibility from the information in that world. After the appearance of the transcending the world, the endless worlds and the branches of the island had, to a certain extent, become one. As a result, there was more or less information exchange between all the worlds. Since there was an exchange of information, some common knowledge that existed in the endless world would naturally be transmitted to every corner of the endless world. Among them was the first level of the islands where the six tribulation experts were. Therefore, they could obtain the secret of transcending the world from the information in that world. As long as the whole world transcends, we can strengthen the communication with the endless world. In that case, we should be able to break through this barrier. The execution ability of those six tribulation experts was beyond imagination. After knowing this, they quickly started to take action. For the six tribulation experts, transcending the world couldn't be more simple. Even under normal circumstances, the six tribulation experts didn't see many times of transcending the world. However, as long as they knew the concept and understood the principles behind it, it would only take them a moment to create the corresponding method. Therefore, they didn't even need to look at the various strange methods of transcending the world contained in the information of the world. They only needed to know the concept of transcending the world to naturally know what they should do to be the most beneficial to themselves. With this change, the six tribulation experts soon began to replace some of the supreme emperors in the world. They took their forces as their own and began to try to transcend the world. However, soon the world shook. An unimaginable sense of danger instantly eroded the six tribulation experts who tried. We're going to die. This was what the six tribulation experts felt at this moment. This feeling told them that if they continued to try to transcend the world, there was only one fate waiting for them: death. How is this possible? If they can transcend the world, why can't I? The expressions of the six tribulation experts changed. They felt as if their worldview had been turned upside down. From the information, they clearly knew that there were billions of people who could transcend the world in this endless world. Among them, there were even false sage existences who could try to transcend the world. This clearly showed that there weren't many thresholds for transcending the world. Even if there were limitations, because they were too powerful, this wasn't right. Although it wasn't clearly stated, they could still feel from the information that there were many of the people who could transcend the world who were like them. In other words, there were also six tribulation experts. This meant that the strength of six tribulation experts didn't exceed the limits of the people who could transcend the world. If that was the case, why would they feel such a sense of danger when they wanted to transcend the world? This was not the situation described in the information that could happen when one transcended the world. If it was an ordinary cultivator, he would probably be dumbfounded by this situation. However, it was obvious that the person who appeared here was not an ordinary cultivator, but a sixth tribulation expert. As six tribulation experts, the limits of their thinking ability were obviously beyond imagination. Therefore, very soon, some six tribulation experts understood what was going on. It's the timing. The timing isn't right now. This conclusion was quickly found by them, and it was quickly accepted by many six tribulation powerhouses. It seems that opportunities to obtain nutrients for breakthroughs are not always available. At the same time, they also understood this point. Chapter 31-39. Thinking that those six tribulation experts might be in the world they had created after they had transcended, these six tribulation experts naturally did not hesitate. Although there were many six tribulation experts in the sixth level of the Town Master's Road, it was impossible for any two of them to have many friendships. However, they were all of the same kind, and they were all six tribulation experts. In this branch of the island, there was still a little friendship between them. For example, it was like meeting a fellow villager in a foreign place. In fact, there were quite a lot of people in one's hometown. If they were just fellow villagers in one's hometown, how could they have any friendship? Maybe they disliked each other and occasionally scolded each other. However, if they were in a foreign country, the situation was obviously different. Encountering someone from the same hometown in a foreign country, even if it was someone they disliked, was very different from encountering someone else. The common attribute of being from the same hometown would make them have a friendship that they did not have in their hometown. At this time, the situation was the same for those six tribulation experts. The sixth level of the Town Master's Road outside was their hometown, and this branch of the island was equivalent to a foreign country. Obviously, they did not have much friendship with each other in their hometown or in the outside world. However, the common attribute of six tribulation experts coming from the outside world was enough to make them have a little friendship with each other. Of course, it was naturally impossible for a six tribulation expert, who was a transcendent, to sacrifice his own interests to benefit them. However, some things that wouldn't harm the six tribulation expert was beneficial to them. This little bit of kindness was enough for the other party to do it for them. Because of this, these six tribulation experts began to use all kinds of methods to contact the world that they had experienced before the world formed after the transcendence of six tribulation expert. Not to mention that the endless worlds were closely connected now. There was a connection between any two worlds, which made this kind of cross-world communication extremely easy. Even if there was no such connection, with the ability and means of these six tribulation experts, it was quite a simple thing for them to establish such a connection. Therefore, very soon, countless inquiries were transmitted to the world where the six tribulation experts who had become a transcendent were. And naturally, this was also transmitted to the hearts of the six tribulation experts who were hiding in these worlds. There was only one six tribulation expert in each island branch. In other words, the number of worlds created by a six tribulation expert who had transcended the transcendent realm was the same as the number of worlds created by the transcendent realm expert who had transcended the transcendent realm was the same. In other words, The number of six tribulation experts corresponding to the six tribulation experts who had come earlier was calculated by tens of thousands. One corresponded to so many. As long as any of the six tribulation experts contacted the six tribulation experts and took action, the six tribulation experts who had come earlier would naturally receive the information of these six tribulation experts. Obviously, with so many latecomers, there were bound to be some who more or less thought like this in any of the island branches, and they also did the same. Therefore, the transcendent transcendence of the sixth tribulation level in every island branch would naturally receive their messages. Although the time might not be the same, some might receive it immediately, some after a few months, and some after a few years. The final result was the same for each branch of the island. In fact, this was something that the six tribulation experts would normally do. And when the number of people who would normally do something increased to a certain extent, it would become something that they would inevitably do. Therefore, there was no need to describe the situation of each branch of the island. Just by looking at the situation of one of the islands, one would be able to see the situation of the tens of thousands of islands. Do you want to know what benefits we have obtained? At this time, the first transcendent transcendent received a message from a certain sixth tribulation expert and couldn't help but reveal a faint smile. At this moment, he had turned into the heavenly Tao and fused with the world that he had brought with him. After a long period of development, this place, which was originally just a small world, had now become a complete world. Moreover, it wasn't just complete. Due to the nurturing of the six tribulation experts, this world had been strengthened to an unimaginable level. Although it was still some distance away from a perfect world, it was already enough to become the most perfect world in this branch of the island. Be it the breadth or depth of the world, the stability of time or space, the perfection of rules and laws, or the various other factors that belong to the world, all of them had reached a level that surpassed any part of the world in the branch of the island. Back then, when the six tribulation experts entered this world, they were still shocked by the wonders of this world for a long time. However, because their goal was to explore the deepest secrets hidden in this branch of the island, they did not stay on this side of the world. I can only tell you that this benefit is tens of thousands of times better than what you have obtained in the void. He immediately sent this message to the six tribulation powerhouses who were inquiring about him. After that, he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to the six tribulation experts at all. Even after that, the six tribulation experts continued to send him all kinds of information to ask him about the specific situation. After all, at this moment, the most important thing for him was to use his identity as a transcendent and the laborer of this branch of the island to absorb as much of the nutrients that leaked out from the process of communication between this branch of the island and some incomparably grand existence in the outside world. Through this kind of absorption, one's own cultivation realm could be improved at every moment and be sublimated. Under such circumstances, every minute and second was extremely important to him. Being able to give them an answer was already a sign of him caring for his fellow countrymen. How could he waste more time on those six tribulation experts and delay the process of obtaining benefits for himself? Very soon, the six tribulation experts who came later understood this point. The information they sent became fewer and fewer until it finally disappeared completely. Looks like the benefits are beyond imagination. This judgment was also agreed by many six tribulation experts at this time. For a moment, an inexplicable expectation and hesitation appeared in the hearts of many six tribulation experts. Expectation. Naturally, they were looking forward to the benefits that were tens of thousands of times greater than what they were getting now. But hesitation was because they didn't know whether it was true or false. They didn't know whether it was a trap, and they didn't know whether there were hidden dangers in it that they didn't know about. After all, everything was based on their own speculations and the words of others. Under such circumstances, how could they be so sure of their own judgment? Of course, with expectation, their next decision was already determined. After all, they were only clones, incarnations, and projections. They weren't their true bodies. As this type of existence, their resistance to disasters was unimaginably strong. Or rather, their endurance was unimaginably strong. Even death was nothing to these six tribulation experts. Perhaps for these incarnations, clones, and projections, death was the end, and it was absolute despair. But for the true bodies of these six tribulation experts, it was just a little bit of power. In this way, with expectation, no matter how great the risk was, it was enough for them to stay on this branch of the island. As a six tribulation expert who transcended the world, they could obtain endless benefits. But now, the time wasn't right. They couldn't become transcendents at all. Therefore, at this time, they could only obediently obtain the benefits that they could get now. As for the rest, they could only wait until the time was right. Therefore, in the next moment, almost all the six tribulation experts began to wholeheartedly focus on the indescribable communication in the void. They carefully comprehended the various nutrients that were revealed in the communication that were of great benefit to their cultivation realm. Through this kind of absorption, their cultivation realm also began to rise bit by bit. Even those who were already at the peak of the six tribulation experts felt that the bottleneck between the six tribulation and seven tribulation experts couldn't resist this kind of push. Under this push, it collapsed bit by bit and disintegrated bit by bit. Although this kind of collapse and disintegration seemed relatively insignificant compared to the incomparably stubborn bottleneck that was like a natural mode, it seemed that it would take countless years for it to completely collapse and disappear. However, the hope of improving was already attractive enough for them to wholeheartedly focus on it. During this process, time slowly passed. At some point, all the changes calmed down. The six tribulation experts felt that they had been separated from the other six tribulation experts. They were no longer in the void, but in an indescribable void. And that indescribable communication, that pushing force that constantly pushed their cultivation realm forward, had completely disappeared without a trace. It was so much so that even the connection they could sense with the other worlds had been completely lost. It was as if they were the only people left in the universe at this moment. What's going on? The six tribulation experts were all confused. However, very soon, all sorts of things that they had observed and sensed from the outside surfaced in the depths of their memories. This is the island branch has branched off again. As they recalled what they had seen before, they gradually came to this conclusion. So this is what happens when the island branches off. Most of the six tribulation experts felt that their curiosity had been satisfied. Of course, there were also a large number of six tribulation experts who felt inexplicably angry and extremely irritated at this moment. They began to cause all sorts of damage to their surroundings. However, this kind of damage only brought disaster to themselves. Their surroundings seemed to be like a spring. No matter what kind of attack or damage they caused, it would instantly rebound back to them, making them directly suffer the attacks and damage they had caused. Through this method, they were able to quickly stop their meaningless acts of destruction. Open up a new world first, then you'll be able to contact the others again. At this moment, a voice spread throughout all the island branches. The minds of the six tribulation experts who were in a state of confusion. This voice belonged to the first transcendent expert who had transcended to the sixth tribulation. It was him who had directly used his authority as a transcendent expert to spread his voice to countless island branches, to all the six tribulation experts who had come later. This method seemed very incredible, but it was actually very simple. After all, as a sixth tribulation expert who had transcended the world, he had unimaginable authority in the island branches. His senses would not be limited by a single island branch, and he could easily transmit his information to the countless island branches. As for how to transmit this information to specific six tribulation experts, it was even simpler. Since his perception was not limited to the island branches, it could spread to countless island branches. Naturally, he could easily sense the existence of those six tribulation experts who were not in any world, but only in the gaps between the heavens and the earth. In this way, the six tribulation experts who had come later could receive his information. After receiving this information, the six tribulation experts naturally had different reactions. Some were doubtful, some were unhappy, and some were angry. However, when they could not think of any other way, they still started to do as the sixth tribulation powerhouse said, and started to split open the sky and earth in the void. As their world gradually took shape, they gradually felt the connection between their world and the other endless worlds. Then, they once again felt the endless world that existed among the countless island branches. Looks like the last fellow Taoist has appeared. The last sixth tribulation expert had just formed the world when he received this message from the world. Chapter 3140. The last sixth tribulation expert was slightly stunned. Then, he understood that they were going to have a meeting. Since they were going to have a meeting, they naturally couldn't treat each other as strangers like before. They naturally needed to communicate with each other. Of course, this kind of communication had to be done through the connection between the heavens and the earth. After all, it wasn't a face-to-face meeting. As a result, the sixth tribulation powerhouse who appeared last began to exchange information with the other six tribulation powerhouses. Not long after, he had completely integrated into the meeting. The one who held this meeting was naturally the first transcendent expert of the sixth tribulation level. The first transcendent at the level of the sixth tribulation was not too special before he transcended the world. In terms of cultivation, there were countless existences at the peak of the sixth tribulation like him. As for intelligence, he was only in the middle among the sixth tribulation experts. With all these conditions, one could imagine his position among the sixth tribulation experts. Although he was at the top, it was just barely. He didn't have any right to speak at all. However, this situation had completely changed after he became a transcendent being. After becoming a transcendent expert, he was the forerunner of all the transcendent experts of the sixth tribulation level. This was because he had the most experience of becoming a transcendent expert as a sixth tribulation expert. The other six tribulation experts were obviously inferior to him in this aspect. Although this didn't mean that the other six tribulation experts had to beg him to become a transcendent expert. But at least it showed that he had the ability to grant favors to other six tribulation experts who wanted to become transcendent experts. It was clear that the first transcendent who had reached the sixth tribulation had done so as well. In the process of many sixth tribulation experts becoming transcendent experts, he took the initiative to provide them with a lot of help, such as information and resources. For those sixth tribulation experts, this kind of help was actually not absolutely necessary. But it had to be admitted that with this help, it saved those sixth tribulation experts a lot of effort. With this kind of effect, the other six tribulation experts had no choice but to owe him favors. Once the number of six tribulation experts increased, the status of the first transcendent expert at the sixth tribulation expert level would naturally stand out, and he would no longer be the same as before. At the very least, his right to speak was many times greater than before. It was precisely because he had this right to speak that the meeting he convened with so many six tribulation powerhouses could go so smoothly. The other transcendents at the level of sixth tribulation did not interfere. Such a result would obviously increase his right to speak among the many six tribulation experts. It would give him more qualifications to intervene in more matters, and that would increase his right to speak once again. Just like that, it formed a cycle. It could be said that if this continued, the first transcendent at the sixth tribulation level would one day become an existence similar to the Alliance Master. It wasn't that the other six tribulation experts couldn't see this, but it was clear that this was not a conspiracy. In the end, even if the first transcendent expert of the sixth tribulation level obtained a position similar to that of the Alliance Master among the many sixth tribulation experts, it wouldn't be much of a loss for them. After all, someone with such authority was needed to gather all of them together to fight for benefits. Since there must be such an authority, what difference did it make if it was him or someone else? In any case, they themselves knew that it would be difficult for them to become such an authority. Because of this, even if the six tribulation experts could see through the thoughts of this transcendent expert, they just went with the flow and didn't take any action to cause trouble for him. At this time, this transcendent expert sensed the many connections in the world around him. A message was transmitted to those worlds according to his will, heading towards those six tribulation experts. This message was nothing else but a summary of the previous situation to those 6 tribulation experts. The previous situation was that the island branch was already in a perfect state, and it was time to give out the rewards. This reward was something that the 6 tribulation experts could sense: the incredible communication between the island branch and the ocean of nothingness in the outside world. Then, he told the 6 tribulation experts everything about the restrictions of this communication, how to reduce these restrictions, how to increase the benefits he could obtain from this communication, and so on. Of course, this wasn't because he had a strong spirit of sharing. It was because if the 6 tribulation experts knew about this, it would be beneficial to him. After all, if those 6 tribulation experts wanted to obtain more benefits, they had to open up more land for the island branch and work harder as laborers for the island branch. Once they did that, the speed and extent of growth of these island branches would be greatly enhanced. This kind of strengthening would clearly allow the island branches to communicate with the House of the Sea in the outside world more frequently and on a grander scale. This was clearly a good thing for the other transcendents who could benefit from such exchanges. That was why he was so proactive in sharing this information. As for why he hid in the world brought by his transcendence when the branch of the island was perfected, instead of merging into the great communication in the nothingness, he didn't hide anything and told the 6 tribulation powerhouses about it. In the world he had created through his transcendence, because the world itself was a part of the island branch, his presence here made the vast communication that had already fused with him become even more direct. If there had been a slight barrier between the two before, with the help of this world, it was as if this barrier didn't exist anymore. Having a barrier and not having a barrier were obviously 2 completely different concepts. If there was a barrier, no matter how small the barrier was, it wouldn't be perfect. If there was no barrier, no matter how small the gap between the barrier and the barrier was, it would be true perfection. There was an intrinsic difference between a matter that was truly perfect and not perfect. For example, the success rate of a matter was 99%. 99% was only 0, 1% away from 100%. No matter how one looked at it, this gap was extremely small. However, was the difference between the two really as small as it seemed? A 100% success rate meant that no matter how many times it was done, no matter how many people repeated it, it would still succeed. However, a 99% success rate was obviously different. For most people, for most of the times, this matter could indeed succeed. It was no different from a normal 100% success rate. However, when there were enough repetitions, the success rate of this matter was 99%, and there would definitely be a number of failures. Compared to the overall number of times, these failures were not of much significance. In a statistical sense, they were almost negligible. But for those existences that just happened to have failed several times, the probability of failure was 100%. From this, it could be seen that a 100% success rate was a 100% success rate at all times. And sometimes a 99% success rate would become a 100% failure rate. This was the difference between perfection and non-perfection. In this place, between this branch of the island and the sea of nothingness outside, there was no barrier between them, which was the difference between perfection and perfection. It was easy to imagine how big the difference was. It went without saying how important it was to be able to integrate oneself into the exchange and become a perfect choice for a transcendent. Hearing that one could integrate oneself into the exchange and become a perfect choice, the 6 tribulation experts were extremely excited. They couldn't be any more clear on how serious the existence of that barrier would affect their integration into the communication. Previously, in the void, they wanted to cry, but had no tears because of the barrier. They could clearly feel that the exchange had endless nutrients that could help them break through, but in the end, they couldn't completely immerse themselves in the nutrients because of the barrier. They couldn't wholeheartedly absorb the nutrients. That feeling was very uncomfortable. They had experienced it once, but they didn't want to experience it a second time. However, the reason why he felt so uncomfortable was mainly because the barrier between them was too strong. But from this, It could be seen how much the barrier affected their integration into the exchange. Now that they heard that becoming a transcendent could eliminate that barrier, they were all overjoyed. They wanted to immediately become a transcendent and completely break that barrier. But what about those ants? Don't tell me they don't have a barrier too? A sixth tribulation expert suddenly asked curiously. This question spread throughout the world where many sixth tribulation experts were located through the transmission of information. The ants he was referring to were naturally those who had transcended the world. In the eyes of the natives of the world, those who had transcended were already very powerful and incredible. But to the sixth tribulation experts, their strength was clearly at the level of ants. They didn't even need to make any real moves. With just a thought, they could mobilize a power that could completely erase them and directly kill them. In this way, those ordinary transcendent experts were naturally just ants in their eyes. All the other six tribulation experts knew what he was referring to. None of them doubted who he was referring to. Although the first transcendent didn't think that ordinary transcendent realm experts were ants, he didn't dwell on it. He simply said, of course, there are no barriers. However, because they had only created an additional world for the island branch, the breadth of communication that they could sense was rather ordinary. It's not even 1/10,000,000th of what I sensed before. 1/10,000,000th. The sixth tribulation experts' expressions changed. Clearly, they had already discovered the hidden meaning behind the words of the first transcendent, a sixth tribulation expert. Ordinary supreme transcendents who had already created their own world could only sense 1/1,000,000th of the amount of communication that the first supreme transcendents at the level of the sixth tribulation had sensed. Then what about them? What about the sixth tribulation experts who hadn't even created a world for the island? Was the communication that they had sensed just 1/1,000,000th of the communication that the first sixth tribulation overlord had sensed? So it's not just that the barrier is stronger. There's also a difference in the breadth. At this moment, an inexplicable desire surged in the hearts of the sixth tribulation experts. The previous 1/1,000,000th gap could bring them such great benefits under such a strong barrier. If the breadth was increased hundreds of millions of times and the barrier was completely removed, how much benefit would it bring them? Would it allow them to directly break through their limits and obtain the qualification to ascend to a higher level of Tao Master and become a seventh tribulation expert? Thinking of this, the sixth tribulation experts couldn't help but be tempted. Sensing the changes in the world, the first sixth tribulation expert revealed a faint smile. It was a good thing that they were tempted. With their help, the growth of this island branch would be even faster and smoother. In this case, the next time the island's branch was completed, the benefits he would gain would be even greater than this time. At this moment, the first sixth tribulation expert's heart skipped a beat. He turned his gaze to an empty void in the endless world. There, a space-time suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Then it began to rise and sublimate. Before long, it had turned into a world. However, the change did not subside. It was still evolving towards a higher level. In other words, it was evolving towards the world. What's going on? It's not the work of any fellow Taoist. Why did the world form? This thought flashed through the mind of the first transcendent expert. He couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. In his senses, no matter if it was the sixth tribulation experts who came first or later, there was not much movement at this time. He could not sense any information belonging to those who came first or later in the transforming world. Therefore, he could be certain of one thing. Chapter 31:41. This doubt didn't linger in his mind for too long. Soon it disappeared, because he had figured out the reason behind it. If it wasn't the six tribulation experts who came first or later, then it must be the cultivators who were born and raised in these island branches, and the most likely ones were those who had transcended. If one thought about it carefully, this seemed to conform to some hidden logic. For example, he now had two identities. One was a sixth tribulation expert, and the other was a transcendent expert. But now he could stay in his own world like a transcendent expert and control all the changes in his world like the heavenly Tao. He could also step out of this world like other six tribulation experts and enter the void of this new island branch. According to the fate of a normal sixth tribulation expert, he would become a coolie for this island branch and open up more worlds for it. If he removed the prerequisite of his identity, he would be able to control everything in his world like the heavenly Tao, and he would also be able to open up more worlds for this island outside of his world. As for whether these two kinds of authority were really bound to those two identities as he had thought before, this was obviously not certain. According to the previous situation, the two kinds of authority seemed to correspond to each other. But what about the reality? Was it true that only sixth tribulation experts could be coolies? Could they help the island branch open up new worlds? In the past, he had thought that this was a matter of course. But after understanding these island branches more and more, he suddenly realized that this was just the wishful thinking of these sixth tribulation experts. For the island branches and the existences behind them, the most important thing was that these island branches could expand continuously. As long as they could achieve this goal, it didn't matter who was the sixth tribulation expert or some other existence that made the island branches expand, who said that only sixth tribulation experts could obtain the authority to help the island branches open up new worlds in the void. If he was the existence behind the island branches, as long as they had the ability to open up new worlds in the void, they would be given such authority by him. Thinking of this, the situation couldn't be more obvious. It was only natural for those who had transcended to obtain that kind of authority. After all, those who had transcended obviously had the ability to open up new worlds in the void, and with this ability, they were qualified to be coolies. Naturally, they could obtain the authority to be coolies. If that's the case, the number of islands that will branch off this time will be countless times more than before. This thought suddenly flashed through the mind of the first sixth tribulation expert. He couldn't help but have a rather complicated expression. In fact, as he thought at this time, in the sixth layer of the road to Tao Master, many sixth tribulation experts were shocked by the changes of the island branches this time. Originally, although the six tribulation powerhouses were shocked by the fact that this place had turned from an island into a huge object that spanned tens of thousands of layers of the void ocean, they were only shocked. After all, the extent of the change was understandable. The number of island branches obviously corresponded to the number of six tribulation experts who had stepped into the island branches. But this time, the situation was obviously far beyond their imagination. This time, the number of island branches that branched out again was not the number of six tribulation experts who had stepped into the island branches. Instead, it was tens of thousands of times more than this number. In the blink of an eye, the number of islands that were originally counted in the tens of thousands had jumped to a terrifying scale that needed to be counted in the hundreds of millions. The scale of the change was far beyond the imagination of all the six tribulation experts. They could not help but be shocked, and it was difficult to understand what had happened inside the island branches. How could it suddenly increase so much? Even if there is only one world in each island branch, the number of worlds is too beyond imagination. Those six tribulation experts were secretly shocked. As for the situation inside the islands, the six tribulation experts outside had already learned about it through various channels. They were no longer as clueless as before about the internal situation of the islands. At least, they knew that the inside of the island branches was a world of its own. It was precisely because of this that the number of branches on the island suddenly increased, which shocked them so much. At this time, more eyes from all over the island branches gathered on these island branches. There were even many disciples of the Tao Masters who had not paid attention to these island branches before, who now focused their attention on them. This situation had never happened before. At least, it had never happened in the sixth layer of the Tao Masters Road. Although billions of years had passed between the many worlds within the island's branch, it was impossible to tell how many billions of years had passed. But in fact, to the outside world, only a few hours had passed since the birth of the first island until it had branched out into hundreds of millions of other branches. For the six tribulation experts, such a short period of time was no different from a moment, or a blink of an eye. Under such circumstances, even if the change was earth-shattering, even if it seemed to contain many unimaginable truths and mysteries, It was impossible to attract the attention of too many experts in the sixth layer of the Tao Master's Road. For a change to attract the attention of more existences, it would take time to brew. It was like a sudden light on a planet that dispelled all the darkness. It was enough for any living creature with eyes to easily notice it, no matter where they were on the planet. However, if the light just flashed by and did not even exceed the reaction time of the living creature's vision, how many living creatures could notice the appearance of the light? Perhaps more living creatures would think that the flashing light was their own illusion, and even wonder if they had just blinked and then mistook the change of light and darkness caused by blinking for that strange light. For those six tribulation experts, the island branches that appeared at this time were like the light. Although at first glance, it was very unusual and incredible, as if it contained countless incredible truths and mysteries, and contained secrets that might allow countless six tribulation experts to break through the bottleneck and ascend. However, because the time it appeared was too short, therefore, most of the six tribulation experts did not have time to notice it. Therefore, before this, although it seemed to be very lively, and countless doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections of the six tribulation experts had already arrived here. However, in fact, these six tribulation experts only occupied a very small part of all the six tribulation experts on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. But this time, when a number of the island branches suddenly increased greatly, suddenly expanding from the level of tens of thousands to the level of hundreds of millions, this instantaneous change finally attracted the attention of almost all the six tribulation experts. From everywhere, even from those places of opportunities, they focused their attention on this place, on the many island branches that were scattered in the countless layers of the nothingness ocean layer. In just an instant, Luo Fan felt some kind of subtle pressure being transmitted over, waking him up from the state of consciousness that had transformed into countless branches of the island. There are actually so many six tribulation experts on this level. Feeling the pressure caused by the eyes, he could not help but feel inexplicably surprised. For the current him, the existence of the six tribulation experts, even to his incarnation, was just like an ant. The eyes of such existences could not bring much pressure to him, no matter what. But now, the eyes of so many six tribulation experts on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path could actually bring such a strong pressure to him and wake him up from that subtle state. How many six tribulation experts could do this? Just like air, a little air could not pressure living creatures at all. No living creature would ever be crushed to death by normal air. However, one day, this air could actually produce such amazing pressure that it could actually wake up living creatures who could not feel the air pressure at all. It could be imagined how much air there was. I'm afraid that the number of practitioners on the fifth and fourth levels is not much less than the number of practitioners on the first 5 and 4 levels. After a slight calculation, he had already made a judgment in his heart. And this situation was obviously different from the logic he knew. Generally speaking, the higher the level, the more powerful the realm, the fewer existences there should be. In other words, the number of second tribulation experts should be less than that of entering tribulation experts. The number of third tribulation experts should be less than that of fifth tribulation experts. In this way, when one reached the level of six tribulation experts, it was obvious that the number of them should be much less than that of fifth tribulation experts. However, at this time, he found that the number of six tribulation experts, at least in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, was not much less than that of fifth tribulation experts. How could this not make him feel surprised? There must be some secret that I don't know about. At this moment, Luo Fan understood in his heart. The mystery of the Tao Master's path might not be as he had thought before. There might be more mysteries contained in it that he could not understand. And this difference in the number of practitioners was obviously one of the manifestations of those secrets. If it were me, how could I do this? How could I make the number of high-level practitioners, which should have been extremely small, become the same as the number of low-level practitioners? This idea came to Luo Fan's mind. The Tao Master's path was created by a true divine. The real secret was not something that Luo Fan, who is not a true divine, could fully understand. Therefore, it was obviously impossible to directly study the Tao Master's path and find out the mystery of the equal number of high-level practitioners and low-level practitioners by studying the Tao Master's path. Obviously, the only way was to bypass all means and directly start with the fundamental goal. That was to directly put himself in the position of the other party and consider what methods he needed to use to achieve that goal. The Tao Master's path itself exists in another time and space. The source of the practitioners is not the Tao Master universe of a certain period of time, but the past, present, and future of the Tao Master universe. If it were me, the best way to maintain the same number of cultivators at each level would be to limit the number of low-level cultivators according to the number of cultivators at the highest and most powerful level. Of course, there are many problems in this. For example, selecting practitioners from the past, present, and future is just a selection of a number of practitioners included in the first level of the Tao Master's path. There are no restrictions on how those practitioners can break through and how to step into the higher levels. It is difficult to specifically control the specific number of practitioners at each level. If I want to bypass this restriction, I must first accurately control the progress of each practitioner, and even control the progress of each practitioner. With this control, the frequency of the admission of practitioners at the first level will be within a range that will not break the balance. Thinking of this, Luo Fan only felt that his eyes only lit up. It seemed that a doubt that had been in his heart for a long time had suddenly been cleared up. Yes, there must be some kind of control mechanism. Otherwise, all the practitioners should have stepped into the Tao Master's path at the same time. There will be no difference. At this moment, he remembered how he had stepped into the Tao Master's path. At that time, the process of him stepping into the Tao Master's path seemed to be a very ordinary process of breaking through a barrier and stepping into a certain special field. There was no special characteristic of transcending time at all, now that he thought about it. In fact, the existence of this frequency control had already been revealed at that time. It should be like this. Only in this way can everything be explained clearly. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression became inexplicably complicated. He didn't feel too excited about finding the most likely secret among all of them, although it was indeed something to be happy about to find such a fact. However, compared with the result of the explanation of this fact, there was not much to be happy about, because this meant that the cultivation progress of almost all the experts in the tribulation realm, including him, had actually been predestined. Chapter 3142. This kind of feeling would obviously not make anyone feel good. If the creator of the Tao Master Path was not a true saint, Luo Fan naturally did not think that it was something that he could not do even if he thought about it was true. However, the creator of the Tao Master Path was not someone else, but an existence at the true saint level. An existence at the level of a true saint had always been a destroyer of common sense. No matter how contrary to common sense it was, if it was a true saint, it would seem to be a matter of course. For example, things like controlling the cultivation potential and progress of billions of cultivators in the past, present, and future would obviously be nonsense if it was applied to any existence that was not a true saint. However, when it was applied to an existence at the true saint level, it did not seem to be surprising at all, and it even seemed to be a matter of course. After all, a true saint was omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient. They were eternal and indestructible. For such an existence, anything that was impossible seemed to be a matter of course for them. All kinds of complicated thoughts flowed through Luo Fan's mind, and his view of the Tao Master Path began to gradually change. In the past, he thought that he had a clear understanding of the true nature of the Tao Master Path in the previous few levels. However, now that he thought about it, his previous understanding of the Tao Master Path might be extremely one-sided. At least, before this, he had not discovered that the specific number of cultivators in the Tao Master Path was equal to each other. The fact that he did not discover this meant that he had missed many details on the path of becoming a Tao Master. In fact, there was evidence for this. His understanding of the specific number of cultivators in those levels of the Tao Master Path was based on a specious state. It seemed that there seemed to be only so many cultivators in those levels of the Tao Master Path, but if he dug carefully, he could find more cultivators from certain positions from time to time. After that, he just calculated logically that the number of cultivators would decrease by an order of magnitude with each increase in level. Relying on this understanding, he observed the levels of the Tao Master Path to determine the scale of the Tao Master Path. Obviously, his perception seemed to have unknowingly distorted his own senses, so that all the details of the road of Tao Master and his cognition seemed to conform to this logic. Only now, when he constructed an unprecedented spectacle that could attract the attention of a huge number of cultivators in an extremely short period of time, did he truly come into contact with the truth of quantity. If it's really as I think, it's just an illusion that I'm on par with the practitioners on the path of the Tao Master. After all, the number of cultivators on the Tao Master's path is just an illusion. It's an illusion after the number has been greatly reduced. At this moment, this idea was sealed in Luo Fan's heart. With this thought, a subtle perception spread to the entire sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. The sixth level of the Tao Master's road was not some other existence. It was not heaven and earth, nor was it a world, space-time, void, or nothingness. Even what Luo Fan was currently in contact with was a stretch of nothingness. There were more things that he had not come into contact with. In such a place, his invincible perception in general heaven and earth, world, space-time, void, nothingness, and even other things was obviously not as strong. At this time, although his perception was expanding in all directions endlessly, and more areas were included in his perception. However, within the scope of his perception, there were still too many secrets that his perception could not shake. These secret areas, in the scope of his perception, were like pieces of dark domains. At most, his perception could only rely on the perception of the edges of the dark domains to determine the existence of those dark domains. Even when he spread his perception to the extreme and expanded the scope of his perception to the maximum, he still did not come into contact with the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. In his perception, the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road was still a boundless existence. No matter how he probed, he could only detect an insignificant portion of this boundless existence. Even in this small part of the area that he could explore, there were too many areas that he could not explore in depth. These areas were of different sizes. Some were like dust, some were like heaven and earth, some were extremely small, and some were extremely vast. There were all kinds of them. And these dark domains did not include the heavens of the six tribulation experts. Although the heavens of the six tribulation experts could not be explored by Luo Fan, and he could only recognize their existence through the outline. However, because of the characteristics of the heavens, Luo Fan could perceive that they were heavens. Therefore, in his perception, it was not a dark domain, but a starry sky. However, that was all. After all, it was an area that his perception could not penetrate. It was already very rare to be able to determine that it was a starry sky. Not enough. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan knew that his detection was actually not enough. The goal that he wanted to find was still hidden in the heavy fog. However, although he realized this, he had to think of a new way to work, in which direction to work, how to lift the fog, and how to reveal the truth in front of him. This distortion of cognition is a kind of natural distortion, and it is also a certain setting of the Tao Master's Road. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The Tao Master's Road was created by those Tao Masters and true sages to cultivate new Tao Masters and new true sages. According to previous experience, all the arrangements here were actually to allow cultivators to obtain enlightenment and improve. Even the individual cultivators selected from the infinite timelines of the past, present, and future to be included in the Tao Master's Road by calculating the speed and progress of a cultivator's improvement was also to maintain the balance of the cultivators on each level of the Tao Master's Road. Why did the number of experts on each level of the Tao Master's Road not too many or too few? The ultimate goal was to allow the cultivators to obtain the best humanistic environment in the process. Wealth, companionship, method, and land were the four essentials of cultivation in the secular world. Although he had reached the level above the experts in the tribulation realm, These four essentials were actually not very accurate. However, the importance of companionship was not much different from that of the secular world. It was also extremely important. In the Tao Master's Road, the number of cultivators on each level was equal, which ensured that no matter which level a cultivator entered, he would have the same opportunity to meet the same number of cultivators. This was obviously of great benefit to the cultivator's cultivation. This kind of adjustment was like this, and the cognitive distortion that Luo Fan perceived now was very likely to be the same. It was also necessary for cultivation. With all kinds of thoughts in his mind, his perception began to explore in all directions. It was not in all directions, nor was it the difference in the direction of up and down, but the difference in the direction of exploration. For example, in different depths, different levels, different angles, different dimensions, and many other directions. His perception seemed to have become countless tiny tentacles and began to explore the depths that he could not explore before, to other levels that he could not explore before, to explore the angles that he had not thought of, and to explore the dimensions that he had not found before. At first, he naturally found nothing. However, very soon, he felt a subtle change appearing in his perception. Vaguely, there seemed to be some kind of invisible limit appearing in front of his perception, making him unable to discover something that seemed to have been discovered. Found it. Although he felt the limit, Luo Fan was not surprised at this moment. Instead, he was happy. His perception felt obstructed, which seemed to be a kind of trouble. But in fact, this meant that he had already found the right direction. It was just like the improvement of the cultivation realm. If you don't first touch the bottleneck, how can you break through? At this time, his perception was the same. Sensing the existence of this obstacle, it also meant that the road to breakthrough was close. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and his perception began to produce all kinds of indescribable adjustments. At the same time, his worldview also began to implement his own perception more strongly. Even though his perception had already fused with his worldview, it was still impossible for him to comprehend it. However, this kind of integration was only a kind of uniform integration after all. It was like ink and water fusing together. After ink and water fused together, the two naturally became indistinguishable, and the color of all the liquids would also be completely distinguished from the two. On the whole, they became the same kind of liquid, and it was no longer possible to tell that they were fused liquids. The fusion of his worldview, his perception, and even everything that belonged to him was the same. Such a fusion indeed allowed everything he had to be implemented by his worldview, and it could make his worldview truly become his true foundation. However, at the same time, doing so also made it difficult for him to exert the true power of his worldview. It was like ink and water fusing together. It did indeed turn the clear water into some kind of colored liquid, but at the same time, as the magical function of ink for writing, the fused liquid had obviously lost most of its function. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to truly exert the original magical function of ink for writing, of course, he could only regather the ink in the fused liquid and recondense the black or other colors in it. Only then could the magical function of writing reappear. At this time, when Luo Fan forcefully implemented his worldview into his perception, it was similar to recondensing the colors in the ink. This wouldn't change the characteristics of his perception that had already fused with his worldview, but it could greatly enhance the magical function of his perception in some aspects. For example, the magical function of breaking the distortion of perception. This kind of enhancement wouldn't be too great. After all, his perception had already fused with his worldview, and it already had various characteristics after fusing with the worldview. At this time, if he further implemented the worldview, it would at most be slightly enhanced on top of perfection. Therefore, before he came into contact with that kind of obstacle, or rather, before he really stood at the door, the effect of this enhancement wouldn't be too great. But now, his perception was clearly already standing in front of that obstacle, and he was already standing at the door of that new world. Under such circumstances, this kind of enhancement seemed to be extremely important. As he carried out the worldview of laws into his perception, he suddenly discovered that some kind of inexplicable shackles had suddenly broken. It wasn't until the shackles broke that he discovered the existence of such subtle shackles on his body. It was only then that he discovered that there was actually some kind of shackles on his perception, his mind, his cognition, his body, his soul, his strength, his might, his divine sense, his ideas, and even his worldview. As this shackle broke, he suddenly felt that the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road within his perception range suddenly lit up. Many dark domains that he couldn't see clearly before were suddenly seen clearly by him. Of course, there was still a large part of the dark domains that were still the same, which he still couldn't see clearly. But the part of the dark domains that he could see almost subverted his understanding of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. In those dark domains, there were all kinds of strange existences. Among them, some were heavens, some were world groups, some were heaven groups, some were chaotic dimensions, some were islands, some were heaven and earth groups, some were worlds, some were space-time, some were fog, some were stars, some were continents, some were all kinds of man-made objects, and even some were magic treasures and celestial devices at a glance. And among those existences, there were a large number of auras of six tribulation experts. The amount of information that Luo Fan felt at this time had already exceeded the number of six tribulation experts that he had previously known. Moreover, it wasn't the number of six tribulation experts that he had known when he first stepped onto the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, but the number that he had realized after he felt those peeping eyes. It was equivalent to the number of fifth tribulation experts on the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road. In just the blink of an eye, the entire sixth level of the Tao Master's Road had already increased by tens of thousands of times in his eyes. And this was only the increase in his perception range. Chapter 31:43. He did not know how much more the sixth level of the Tao Master's path had expanded beyond his range of perception. Follow? Dream? Calm. These areas that had just been discovered by Luo Fan were not that special. They were not fundamentally different from the areas that Luo Fan had known before. The cultivators, they were no different from the previous ones. Perhaps, in those cultivators' perception, the sixth level of the Tao Master's path had always been what they had sensed. There was no deeper concealment, which was in line with their own logical expectations for the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Just like Luo Fan before, if it was an ordinary existence, Luo Fan would naturally not think so. He would inevitably think that there was a barrier between concealment and unconcealment, and that what he saw was a different world and a different area. However, it was obvious that in the Tao Master's path, the situation was obviously not like this, because the one who controlled everything was not an ordinary existence, but a true saint. The means of a true saint could even silently distort his cognition, so that he could not see the truth and see the real Tao Master's path. How could the method be so clumsy? Only when everyone's perception was within their own cognitive range could they interact with each other normally. But in terms of cognition, there would be some differences in the details of the Tao Master's path, which made their cognition of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path in line with their logic, and even in line with their way of cultivation. Only in this way could it be worthy of the level of a true saint's means. Is this the real sixth level? No, this is just the sixth level that I know now. Luo Fan looked at the almost new sixth level of the Tao Master's path, and such a thought flashed in his mind. At this moment, he truly felt the inconceivability of the Tao Master's methods. Even the setting of the Tao Master's path, which seemed to have no hidden mysteries, had such incredible settings and hidden so many unimaginable mysteries. Then what about the others? What about the other cultivation points? What about the various cultivation environments? What about the natural landscapes? What about the clusters of worlds and worlds? What about the many truths and mysteries hidden in the depths of nothingness? With this association, he felt that the world in front of him had suddenly become incomparably vast. Previously, he did not care about the path of Tao Master, but at this moment, it had disappeared without a trace. That's right. Before this, Luo Fan had already given up on the Tao Master's path. The reason for this was not because he was too arrogant and conceited, but because he had obtained all sorts of information from the true sage about the path of going against the flow of time. He had placed the focus of his cultivation on the great calamity. After all, the true divine had clearly said that for those who walked the path of the reverse, the great tribulation was the focus of cultivation and the key to improving. Apart from that, everything else was to prepare for the great tribulation's cultivation. They were all building a foundation for cultivation during the great tribulation. It was all for the sake of obtaining the qualifications to step into the great tribulation. With this understanding, how could he still care about the cultivation of the Tao Master? Naturally, he would not care about the Tao Master's path at all. It was like a person who knew that something was just a transition to something better. Knowing that a house was just a temporary place to live for a better house, then how much would he cherish that thing in that house? How much importance would he attach to it? Obviously, that kind of cherishing and that kind of importance cannot be much. As for things, because they knew that it was a transition and would soon be abandoned, it was naturally impossible to cherish it as if it was their own treasure. It could be said that if they could use it, they would use it, and they would rarely take care of it. As for houses, they knew that it was a transitional house, and they knew that it would soon be abandoned. Naturally, no one would do the best decoration for the house and put all their savings on the house. Before this, for Luo Fan, the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was obviously a transitional house. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that he didn't care about it. However, it was clear that his understanding of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was greatly limited. He discovered that the sixth level of the Tao Master's path contained even more mysteries that he had yet to discover. His indifference vanished in an instant. Although in the description of the true sage, the Great Tribulation was the key to the cultivation of the Tao Master's path, it was obvious that the creation of the true sage was not within the scope of the description. It seems that I have to pay more attention to them. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, incarnations rushed out of his heavens one after another, heading toward the broader and more abundant cultivation places of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. There were all kinds of strange groups of heaven and earth, groups of worlds, groups of space-time groups, strange dimensions, islands, mist, stars, continents, and even celestial devices and magic treasures. There were many experts of the six tribulations exploring and cultivating in those places. The goal of Luo Fan's incarnations was to find those places. However, the experts of the six tribulations did not care about the arrival of Luo Fan at all. None of the practitioners found Luo Fan's appearance strange. None of the experts of the six tribulations thought that Luo Fan's appearance was beyond their imagination. Obviously, this proved Luo Fan's previous speculation. In the cognition of those practitioners, the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was similar to what Luo Fan had known before. It was not that the appearance was similar, but the scale of the experts of the six tribulations was similar to what Luo Fan had known before. In their cognition, Luo Fan's existence, and even they had already felt his aura. Although, in Luo Fan's perception, before he recognized their existence, he couldn't feel their aura, and he couldn't discover their existence. However, this was one of the mysteries of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the goal of Luo Fan's incarnations was the various cultivation places that he had just discovered and that had appeared in his cognition. There were quite a large number of these places. If he were to explore them one by one, it would take billions of years for him to go through one round. Therefore, he could only rely on his incarnations to explore. Fortunately, it was not difficult for him to divide his incarnations. Even though he had created billions and trillions of clones, it was still the same. Therefore, no matter how many areas there were, for him, it was just a situation that he could explore at the same time if he wanted to. Different areas had different mysteries. For the cultivators who stepped into them and the existences who grasped the essence of the cultivation place, there were also great differences in the benefits. Some of the benefits could not even be specifically described in words. One could only vaguely feel the existence of those benefits. Moreover, not all the benefits were beneficial to the heavens. Some even had some negative effects on the development of the heavens. but they were helpful to other existences. It could be said that after breaking the shackles of cognition, the sixth level of the Tao Master's Path in Luo Fan's eyes had become a cultivation place that was many, many times more magnificent than before. Of course, at this time, what touched Luo Fan the most was not the appearance of the many cultivation places that he had not discovered before in the sixth level of the Tao Master's Path. Although these countless new cultivation places could allow him to make great progress in all aspects, it was still not enough. What really touched Luo Fan the most was some kind of subtle sublimation in his self-perception after breaking the cognitive distortion and cognitive shackles. At this moment, although it was still a short time, he could already clearly feel that he was very different from his previous self. Judging from the divine sense of perception alone, the divine sense of perception that he displayed now was at least twice as strong as before. In addition, his own worldview seemed to have some kind of inexplicable vitality, as if every point of view in it had a subtle self-derivation and self-proliferation flavor. It seemed that this worldview was beginning to grow on its own and achieve self-perfection. Of course, this flavor was extremely faint at this time, close to non-existent. But after all, there was already a little bit of such a flavor. Compared to other progress, such a change was obviously more important to him. If he were to use an ordinary person as an analogy, the other changes would be equivalent to giving him some kind of external object, such as the existence of food. But now, the changes that appeared in his worldview seemed to have given him some kind of ability. This was the difference between giving a man a fish and teaching a man to fish for a day. With this kind of subtle vitality, it was naturally impossible for him to let this worldview grow on its own and reach the true sage stage on its own. But at least this subtle vitality could allow him to sense the direction of perfection of this worldview, and it could greatly improve the efficiency of perfection of his worldview. If this was calculated in terms of time, it might be the acceleration of time for hundreds of billions of years. Obviously, this was a change that was similar to breaking out of a cocoon and becoming a butterfly. For Luo Fan, the significance was beyond imagination, and this was only the benefit that he had obtained after slightly breaking free from the shackles of the Tao Venerable Path. This made him look forward to the benefits that this Tao Venerable Path could give him. Integrating opportunity into cognition. Such a method is shocking no matter how many times I see it. At a certain moment, after carefully experiencing the changes in his worldview, Luo Fan could not help but sigh with emotion. At this moment, he had completely determined that this distortion of cognition was not some kind of shackles that a true divine used against ordinary cultivators. It was just some kind of opportunity that a true divine gave to ordinary cultivators. The higher one's cultivation realm, the clearer one's understanding of what a true divine could do. In the beginning, when he was in the innate zenith heaven realm, Luo Fan thought that true divine was actually a realm that could be reached after breaking through the innate zenith heaven realm. After that, in the sage-to-be realm, he thought that the true sage realm was above the sage-to-be realm. However, he didn't know that there was the false sage realm, the hopeless realm, the supreme emperor realm, and now the calamity realm. The more he cultivated, the more Luo Fan understood the greatness of a true divine, and the more he understood how big the gap between him and a true divine was. Not to mention anything else, he would not be surprised to hear that there were many realms above the tribulation realm, if not for the few words left by many true divine telling him that the true divine was above the tribulation realm. If such an existence at the true divine realm really wanted to deal with an existence below the true divine, one could imagine how easy it would be. Luo Fan did not believe that if such an existence really wanted to shackle his cognition, he would be able to break through. In other words, if a true divine really did not allow him to know, he would never know. Everything that he did not know at first, but could find out later, must be things that the true divine had set up for him to know. For example, this kind of cognitive shackle was the same. If a true divine really wanted to completely distort his cognition, to completely shackle his cognition, he would never be able to break this kind of shackle at this time. and it would be impossible for him to restore his own cognition. Combined with the benefits that he had obtained after breaking the cognitive shackle, he could naturally know that this kind of cognitive shackle was actually a kind of cultivation opportunity that the true divine had set up for all the cultivators who had stepped into the Tao Master's path. From the first level of the Tao Master's path, it was a kind of cultivation opportunity that permeated their body and mind. The purpose of its existence was obviously to be broken by the cultivators, to be twisted back by the cultivators. As for the level of the Tao Master's path, this kind of cognition will be twisted back, and this kind of cognitive shackle will be broken. Obviously, it would depend on a cultivator's own ability and luck. I should be considered fast. This thought came to Luo Fan's mind, and he could not help but show a slight wry smile on his face. Based on his current level of the Tao Master's path, the time that he took to break this kind of cognitive shackle was indeed fast. However, based on his real cultivation realm, the speed at which he broke the cognitive shackle might not be very fast. After all, his real cultivation realm was the peak of the 7 tribulations, and he had even sensed that his 8th major tribulation was approaching the level of him. Clearly, he could no longer be held to the same standard as an ordinary 6th tribulation expert. Now, the standard that he used should obviously be the standard of those 7 tribulations experts, or even the standard of those 8 tribulations experts. But if he were to use this standard to calculate, it would be hard to say where he would rank. Chapter 31:44. When Luo Fan broke through the shackles of knowledge, it was unknown how many trillions of years had passed in the branches of those islands. Although Luo Fan's speed was quite fast, every step he took to break through the shackles of cognition was extremely short. However, no matter how short it was impossible to complete it in just a few breaths. The whole process of breaking through the shackles of cognition and the distortion of cognition took him several days. Clearly, a couple of days in the outside world was an unimaginably long time in comparison to the island branch. And this unimaginably long period of time was obviously enough for the island branches to undergo all kinds of incredible changes. Among them, the island branches were no longer the same as before. Compared to the time before Luo Fan broke through the shackles of cognition, the number of island branches had increased many times. It could be said that in terms of quantity, it had truly surpassed the number of world phantoms. And this was because the time in the outside world was too short. In just a few days, because of the peculiarity of the island branches, the number of 6 tribulation experts gathered was quite limited. If it were a little longer, it would not be unbelievable for the number of island branches to multiply several times. And in the process, the number of 6 tribulation experts who entered the island branches had exceeded the estimation of most 6 tribulation experts on the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. However, because of the existence of the distortion of cognition, even if they watched the many 6 tribulation experts step into those island branches, they did not associate this with the number of 6 tribulation experts. They completely turned a blind eye to the abnormality in the number. However, this kind of turning a blind eye to any of the 6 tribulation experts did not interfere with their cultivation, did not interfere with any of the 6 tribulation experts, did not interfere with their cultivation, and did not interfere with any improvement. The mystery of this could only be explained by the means of a true saint. However, in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road, Luo Fan was the only one who could understand this mystery. At least, as far as Luo Fan knew, he was the only one. He even suspected that the number of 6 tribulation experts he had noticed was only a portion of the total number of 6 tribulation experts who had stepped into his island branch. After all, he couldn't guarantee that his knowledge had been completely reversed and that the shackles of knowledge he had suffered had been completely broken. After a few days in the outside world, countless trillions of years of development had passed within the island branches, and the situation had clearly undergone tremendous changes. Now, the land of no family was no longer determined by its potential alone. Right now, the land of no family was truly a land of no family. Even the number of transcendents and 6 tribulation experts was terrifying. Among them, there were trillions of transcendents and the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses was only 1 in 10 millionth of them. However, even if it was only 1 in 10 million, it was still a terrifying number of tens of billions. At this stage, it could be said that the number of tribulation experts and the countless island branches had reached an unimaginable level. It was even enough to transform quantity into qualitative change and pose an unimaginable threat to Luo Fan, who was a peak 7th tribulation expert. Now, Luo Fan's incarnation seemed to have transformed into the grand heavenly way above the land of no family, and its consciousness was similar to the land of no family. However, in reality, his control over this land of no family, over the countless islands and branches, had weakened by who knew how many times. Previously, he could directly change the inclinations of the laws of the countless island branches and directly build the soil for the emergence of transcendence. For the current him, he could no longer do it. Now, the consciousness gathered by the countless transcendents, including ordinary transcendents and 6 tribulation experts, was the true consciousness that controlled the island branches. They were the true controllers of the various fundamental laws of the land of no family that existed in the countless island branches. Of course, the consciousness of all the transcendents was actually an abstract concept. It didn't truly exist. It was like the consciousness of a nation. Clearly, it was a consciousness that permeated the entire nation's subconscious. For those who had transcended the world, the collective consciousness they formed was similar to the abstract consciousness of a nation. Although this consciousness permeated every aspect of the land of no family, one could vaguely sense that this consciousness was controlling everything, arranging everything, and handling everything. However, even the 6 tribulation powerhouses would not be able to find such a consciousness. Because this consciousness was abstract, it couldn't be controlled by a single transcendent. It represented the interests of all the transcendents. It could even be said that it represented the interests of the land of no family among the countless island branches. It could be said that when this abstract consciousness formed, it meant that Luo Fan's incarnation could no longer control the countless island branches. He could no longer control the development of the land of no family. And it was also at this point that the development of the island branches began to slow down. In fact, the time it took for the island branches to branch out was already many times slower than at the beginning. In terms of time in the outside world, it would take a few breaths of time for the island branches to branch out again. But now, this process had become over 100 breaths of time. And in terms of the time inside the island branches, this period of time was trillions of years. However, although the speed of development had slowed down, it was precisely because of this that the development of the island branches had become more stable. The entire process of development had become more complete. The loopholes that had appeared because of the hasty branching in the past were continuously reduced as the development slowed down. In fact, in the most recent branch, the branch process had almost reached perfection. As for the standards of the branches, the rules of the branches, how the newcomers could obtain benefits, how the early arrivals could obtain more benefits, what the benefits were, and so on and so forth, they had already become existences akin to fundamental rules. There was no need for anyone to specifically explain them. As long as one used their heart to experience the land of no family, they would naturally be able to understand all of these things. Moreover, the original man-made traces of these various settings could no longer be found. It felt as if these settings were the truth of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, as if they had been set up by the true saint when he first opened the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. It could be said that at this point, these island branches had already become an inseparable part of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. They had become the existence of all the other natural landscapes in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, such as the nebulas, the continents, the special dimensions, and even the strange groups of heaven and earth, world, and space-time groups. Of course, for the time being, this was just a trend. If Luo Fan's incarnation stopped supporting these island branches at this time, then the island branches would gradually collapse due to the loss of their foundation and eventually disappear completely. unless these island branches could continue to develop in this way for a period of time. And when the abstract consciousness of the person who had transcended truly stabilized and completely replaced the role of Luo Fan's incarnation, this hidden danger could be eliminated, and these island branches could completely get rid of their dependence on Luo Fan's incarnation. In other words, the longer Luo Fan's incarnation stayed in these island branches, it meant that the Tao Master's path would seize more island branches, and it meant that the time of losing these island branches was closer. It could be said that a powerful existence with a strong desire for control would rather destroy these island branches than watch these island branches be seized by the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. However, it was obvious that although Luo Fan had a strong desire for control, compared to controlling everything, what he wanted more was to improve himself and sublimate himself. From the time he first built an island to today's behemoth that penetrated billions of trillions of layers of nothingness, he had always had only one purpose: to improve himself and sublimate himself. Under such circumstances, if these island branches could help him achieve this goal, he would not care at all whether they belonged to him, the Tao Master's path, or simply seized by other practitioners. As long as they could help him in his cultivation, as long as he could get more help and absorb more nutrients from these changes, it did not matter. Obviously, the changes of these island branches at this time met this condition. Therefore, even though he knew that these island branches were gradually getting out of his control and gradually becoming a natural landscape of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, he did not think of a way to interrupt this process. He even took the initiative to create various conditions for the development of this process, and tried his best to help this change continue to advance. His performance might not have been noticed by those who had transcended in the first place. However, as time passed, as more and more traces were revealed, those who had transcended gradually began to understand this fundamental attitude of his. As they understood this, more and more of those who had transcended began to gradually relax. Although some of them did not understand Luo Fan's attitude and believed that if it were them, they would not do the same as Luo Fan, but most of them clearly understood him. Moreover, regardless of whether they understood or not, they were still happy to see Luo Fan's ulcers. After all, this kind of unrestrained ulcers was clearly more beneficial to them. After several days in the outside world, after countless trillions of years of development, the biggest change in the island branches was not the increase in the number of transcended experts. The biggest change was that the transcendents had finally found the way to a higher level that they had been pursuing tirelessly. Currently, in this lifeless land, apart from the transcendent transcendents who were originally at the 6th tribulation level, the other transcendent transcendents had already reached the 3rd tribulation level. That's right, they had not only found a way to step into the 2nd tribulation level, but they had also gone one step further and found a way to step into the 3rd tribulation level. Currently, among the countless trillions of transcended experts, the number of 3rd tribulation experts was already several times greater than the number of 6th tribulation experts. The number of 2nd tribulation transcendents was tens of times greater than that of 3rd tribulation transcendents. The number of tribulation experts was also several hundred times greater than the number of 2nd tribulation experts. As for why they were able to break through, the most direct reason was naturally the formation of the abstract consciousness of the transcended experts. And the fundamental reason was that the 6th tribulation experts had thoroughly integrated into the circle of transcended experts. Because these transcendent transcendents at the level of 6th tribulation had completely integrated into the circle of transcendent transcendents, the abstract consciousness of transcendent transcendents had the opportunity to take shape. And the formation of this abstract consciousness had thoroughly integrated the subconscious of the 6th tribulation experts. In other words, it had integrated the cultivation path of the 6th tribulation experts, as well as all of their knowledge of cultivation. This fusion became the foundation of all transcendence, allowing them to follow the entire cultivation process of transcendence from the tribulation realm all the way to the 6th tribulation realm. In this way, as long as the transcendent beings carefully comprehend this abstract consciousness, they would naturally be able to find a way out of cultivation and find a way to advance further. Combined with the continuous expansion of the island branches and the increasing number of heavens and earths, they gradually found the true path and stepped into a higher realm. It could be said that the six tribulation experts had completely integrated into the foundation of their consciousness, allowing the transcended experts to take a step further in their consciousness. And the increase of the heavens and earths and the expansion of the island branches were the material foundation that allowed them to truly turn the possibility of their consciousness into reality. Chapter 31:47. It was an organization that wasn't very secretive to begin with. Many of its members had set up their own organizations, and these organizations were hostile to each other, even wishing to wipe away all traces of each other. Naturally, such an organization only existed in name. But now, there wasn't much meaning to this organization that managed all the transcendent beings. In the past, this organization had great significance to the endless world. It ensured the sustainable development of any part of the world and did its best to prevent the destruction of the world due to the frequent appearance of the transcendent beings. But that was only in the past. Now, as the number of the transcendent beings increased and the overall consciousness of the transcendent beings took shape, this function of the organization gradually became meaningless. Back then, the organization had to use unimaginable authority to limit the frequency of the appearance of the transcendent beings, the size of the world they could carry, and so on, because the world itself couldn't do anything about it. But now, as the situation changed, the overall consciousness of the transcendent beings had completely covered the entire world. Because of the implementation of this consciousness, the various rules of the organization had unknowingly become some kind of fundamental rule of the endless world. In other words, it wasn't that the transcendent beings couldn't violate these rules in the past, but because of the possible punishment that the organization could impose, they didn't dare to violate these rules. But now, it wasn't that they didn't dare to violate these rules, but that they couldn't. Although there seemed to be no restrictions, and the world didn't seem much different from before, now, if the cultivators who wanted to transcend did not follow the rules of the organization, they would definitely not be able to transcend successfully. This was the result of the overall consciousness of the transcendent beings thoroughly penetrating the endless world. And with this implementation, it also meant that there was no longer any need for the organization to continue existing. But although there was no longer a need for it, this organization had a history of countless trillions of years and had long become a kind of common sense. It was like the existence of the endless world, like the existence of the transcendent beings, like the existence of cultivation, like the existence of all living beings. As such, even if its functions were no longer needed, before there were any major changes, the organization was still like an eternal and unmoving scenery, standing tall in the endless world, becoming a huge organization that ran through the endless world or even stood above the endless world. Obviously, at this moment, a huge change occurred. Although it was just some different salvation organizations with different ideals, the result was even more tragic than the sudden appearance of some terrifying villains. If there were antagonists, one side would be righteous while the other side was evil. Their standpoints would be completely different. The side of justice would naturally be more resolute and have a greater sense of mission. They would be more willing to sacrifice themselves, and the possibility of winning in the end and ending the disaster would naturally be much greater. However, the current conflict was not between good and evil, but between justice and justice. They all believed that they were righteous, that their ideals were correct, and that they could save the endless world. They believed that the ideals of other organizations were wrong, that they were delaying the endless world, and that they were examples of people who did bad things with good intentions. Under such circumstances, their sense of mission, sense of responsibility, and being the only sober person in the world could be imagined. Therefore, any one of them would be extremely firm in their actions and might even sacrifice themselves without any hesitation. If it was just a single organization, they would be able to quickly gain the upper hand and end the disaster. However, if it was multiple organizations, or even every organization, it would be completely different. That would be a terrifying disaster for the endless world. Therefore, more and more chaos gradually appeared in the endless world. As time passed, the hatred that originally didn't exist gradually began to appear between different organizations. Those originally incomparably firm ideals of saving the world became firmer and more resplendent in the process, where they were gradually distorted and replaced by hatred. This caused the chaos, which had a chance to be controlled at the beginning, to become increasingly uncontrollable. This chaos affected the endless world and became the true source of disaster for the endless world. Our efforts to save the endless world have ultimately become the start of a disaster. Could this be the so-called fate? On a certain day, tens of billions of years after the first Salvation Organization appeared, the leader of a certain Salvation Organization looked up at the sky and sighed. His voice spread to many worlds and reached the members of his organization. These Salvation Organizations were formed by people who had transcended the world, and they naturally had their own world formed by their transcendence. Therefore, even though it was only an organization, the members of the entire organization added together were enough to form a colossus. It could be said to be a grand group of worlds. Therefore, if they wanted to contact each other, they would usually rely on communication channels between different worlds. Of course, this didn't mean that this was the only way for them to contact each other. Don't forget, after becoming a transcendent, they would obtain the authority to monopolize a new island branch the next time they branched out. This authority would allow them to step into the void of the island branch, or step into the endless world and begin to establish an endless world within the endless world. This endless world would once again branch out in the next round of island branches, creating even more islands that would be monopolized by the newly born transcendents. After a few rounds like this, it could be said that the relationship between the transcendents had become extremely complicated. It could be said that almost any transcendent already had the authority to traverse different islands and different worlds. After all, almost every world created by a supreme transcendent expert will be dispersed into countless islands after the islands were branched off one after another. Originally, before the transcendents appeared, the ownership of these worlds wouldn't allow the existences who established the worlds to traverse the endless island branches. This was because before that, the world between the different island branches didn't have a direct connection. Without a direct connection, once the worlds were distributed among the different island branches, it would be nearly impossible for them to sense each other. However, after the appearance of the Transcendent Realm experts, this situation had completely changed. The connection between the endless worlds that had been established by the emergence of transcendence would naturally connect the branches of different islands together. When the different islands were connected, they belonged to different islands, but they all belonged to the same transcendent being. Naturally, it would not be an obstacle for those transcendent beings to communicate with each other. Thus, from that moment on, the existences who could work for the island branches and establish the worlds for the island branches wouldn't be shackled by a single island branch. Instead, they could travel to the island branches they established at any time and any place. When the island branches finished growing and began the next round, it was clear that the division wasn't based on the number of worlds and their attributes. The birth of the island branches was completely based on the number of laborers. In other words, the division was based on the number of cultivators who established the worlds. In this way, it was almost impossible for there to be only one world in each new island branch. Every new island branch would have a different number of worlds, which would be given to the island branches at the same time. As a result, every time a new island branch appeared, it would be created by a different transcendent being. And this resulted in another result. Each new island branch would have a world created by a different transcendent. In a new island branch, there would be more than one pioneer who could cross the island branch and enter the other island branch. Instead, it was in relation to the number of the world creators in the new island branch. And as the owner of the new island branch, The transcendents who were given the authority to work for the expansion of the new island branch would have the authority to travel to any world within the island branch. This made it possible for the world creators to meet each other personally. The laborers of this island branch and the laborers of the other island branches would obviously have a connection in a certain world. If the number of the island branches were not many, the impact of such a personal meeting would be great, but it would still be limited. But once the number of the island branches increased to a certain extent, the impact would become immeasurable. You have authority on this island, but you don't have authority on the other island. On the other hand, I have authority on the other island, but I don't have authority on these two island branches. Just like that, as the number of the island branches increased, the complexity of the relationship would increase exponentially. In the end, the relationship between the transcendents would become unprecedentedly complicated, and this complicated relationship would allow any two transcendents to find a way to meet each other personally, as long as they were willing to look for it. And this was only for two transcendents. If the number of transcendents in the world increased to a sufficient number, the possibility of such a personal encounter would greatly increase. After all, transcendents didn't just rely on their own strength to step into a certain island branch. They could borrow the power of others and the authority of other transcendents to step into other island branches. Although it was a little troublesome, it wasn't impossible. And at this time, which salvation organization in this boundless world would have a small number of transcendents? Therefore, it wasn't difficult for any salvation organization to gather all its members together. Generally speaking, the headquarters of any salvation organization would be set up on an island branch that was closest to all the members of the organization. In other words, it would be in a world. For example, the world where the headquarters of this salvation organization was located was the world that had the closest connection with all the supreme transcendents in the organization. Any supreme transcendence in this organization only needed two people at most to find the path to enter that world at this time. After hearing the words of the leader of the salvation organization, the world where the members of the organization were located was silent. The topic of fate was a very heavy one, even for these transcendent beings. This was especially true when they felt that this kind of fate really existed and that it was incomparably difficult for them to struggle within it. After a long time, a member of the organization said, "Perhaps it is fate, but we don't have a choice. To save the world, we have to destroy the other organizations. Only our organization can save the boundless world." At this time, how could there be any salvation organization that couldn't see the source of the calamity? But so what if they could see it clearly? Their ideals of saving the world would only become firmer when they saw the source. But it wouldn't collapse because they saw the source clearly. At the very least, that was the case for the salvation organizations that still existed in the boundless world. Those organizations that couldn't see the source of the calamity and those that couldn't strengthen their ideals had completely collapsed and disappeared in history over the past tens of billions of years. Therefore, at this time, none of the members of this organization were shaken by the fact that the source of the calamity was them. All of them firmly believed that they were the main characters that could save the boundless world from the calamity and that all other salvation organizations had gone astray. They would only make the boundless world more chaotic and closer to destruction. Even if they were to save the world, they had to be completely destroyed. That's right, they must be destroyed. The leader of the organization, a transcendent who had transcended 3 tribulations, said resolutely. In fact, it was not merely to unify their thoughts that they were saying these things here and now in this manner. Their true goal was to encourage them before the battle. This was because they were about to start an earth-shattering war. It was a terrifying war that could destroy hundreds of worlds and erase a world salvation organization along with these worlds. The disaster that this war would cause might be the greatest disaster in the boundless world in the past tens of billions of years. The destruction and death it would cause would be unprecedentedly terrifying. Chapter 31:48. Soon, one of the countless island branches suddenly trembled. The source of this tremble was none other than a certain layer of the island branch. or rather, it was the destruction of a certain layer of the world. This was the first step of the Salvation Organization's operation. It was clear that the Salvation Organization had prepared for a long time to complete this step. Once it was activated, it produced an unimaginable effect, starting with the complete destruction of a part of the world. This part of the world was none other than the logistics of the hostile organization that they wanted to destroy. Any organization would have its own division of labor. Even for organizations that had members who had transcended the world, it was the same. For example, logistics, headquarters, distribution, internal affairs, law enforcers, and so on also existed in these organizations. However, compared to ordinary organizations in the secular world, their functions were more mysterious. For example, the Internal Affairs Department provided and managed all sorts of information, templates, race seeds, management plans, and so on that were incomprehensible to the people of the secular world. Many other departments had similar functions and were also fundamentally different from the departments in the secular world. However, its role in the organization and its importance to the organization was similar to the importance of those departments in ordinary secular organizations. The importance of the logistics department to an organization was self-evident. It could be said that without the logistics department, the organization would have no foundation. Without the logistics department, the organization would exist in name only. Therefore, attacking with the logistics department was clearly the best choice to deal with an organization. In a situation where there was no way to directly attack the enemy's headquarters at this time, the importance of this part of the world to the hostile Salvation Organization was similar to the importance of the logistics department to an organization. It was precisely because of this that this part of the world was completely destroyed in the first wave of attacks. At this moment, countless gazes shot out from the many island branches and gathered on the ruins of the logistics department. "How dare you!" Furious roars appeared out of nowhere and instantly enveloped the ruins. At this moment, the endless world began to tremble slightly. Some kind of indescribable fluctuation reverberated among the many island branches, as if the countless island branches were readjusting themselves and forming a perfect system. Although the endless heavens and earth seemed to have endless heavens and earth, every single heavens and earth seemed incomparably small compared to the endless heavens and earth. But in reality, every world was an extremely important part of the endless world. That was because every world was an indispensable layer of a certain island's branch. And every island branch was an indispensable part of the entire island branch system. Only when all the islands and branches were gathered together would they form the complete foundation of the endless world. In this way, the destruction of any part of the world would cause unrest in the branch of the island it was in. This kind of turbulence would definitely affect the entire island branch system, and then affect the endless world that was the foundation of this island branch system. It was precisely because of this that there were endless ripples reverberating in the endless world. At this moment, in the face of such a change, Luo Fan's gaze was involuntarily focused on the island branch where this world was located. The destruction of a world that was an important part of the island was something that had never happened since he first constructed the complete island. For a long time, the number of worlds had only increased, and they had never been destroyed. Even the greatest disasters, even the greatest tribulations of the world, in the end, would only cause the world's interior to shatter into countless pieces. The world as a whole was still complete. Of course, this was not because the world would not collapse after it was born. Instead, it was because Luo Fans had always enveloped the endless island branches, drawing the final bottom line for the endless world's disasters and tribulations. It was precisely because of the existence of this bottom line that no matter what kind of tribulations those worlds encountered, no matter how the cultivators fought inside and outside the world, they would not truly destroy any of the worlds. But clearly, this bottom line no longer existed. Luo Fan's authority over the countless island branches had already been suppressed by the collective consciousness of the many transcendents. Although he could still fuse with the vast exchange between the countless island branches and the void ocean, and could still obtain the nutrients he needed from this exchange at all times. However, his control over this boundless world had been greatly reduced. This reduction made it impossible for him to draw the bottom line for the endless world, which was why this world was finally completely destroyed in this battle that was not actually the most intense since the island branches had appeared. The Salvation Organization that had launched the attack was also slightly stunned by this change. Although everything had been planned and carried out by them, they still found it hard to believe when they saw that their plan had caused this world to completely collapse and achieved the first world-destroying achievement since the birth of the Endless World. As expected, the Endless World is no longer the same as before. The soil for the disasters and tribulations has already been prepared. The leader of the Salvation Organization sighed and became even more determined to destroy the opposing Salvation Organization. He paid no attention to the questions from the other Transcendents. He immediately followed his own plan and started to pursue and attack the enemy organization. They actually destroyed the world. At this moment, Luo Fan watched all of this and felt a strong urge to make a move. Although his authority in the countless island branches had been squeezed and even replaced, he was still a peak 7 tribulation expert no matter what. If he really wanted to make a move, none of the transcendents in the world would be able to truly resist him. Moreover, although his authority had been suppressed and replaced, he was still the creator of the countless island branches. The roots of these island branches still originated from him. No matter what, he definitely still had a bit of authority over the endless world. This bit of authority might not allow him to completely control the countless island branches and the endless world like before. However, it was still not a problem for him to display extraordinary strength in this place, with these various conditions. If he wanted to make a move, the Salvation Organization that had destroyed the world would definitely not be able to hold out for long. In less than a few minutes, he would definitely be able to get rid of them completely. However, after some thought, he still suppressed his intention to make a move. Firstly, the current situation of the island branches was much better than he had imagined. Although the world in the island branches had lost a layer due to the sudden destruction, it looked like a chain had suddenly broken in the middle. This should have caused the chain to completely collapse or turn into 2 incomplete chains. However, in reality, there were all sorts of indescribable nutrients constantly being transmitted over from the endless world. They continuously flowed into the island branches and stabilized the other worlds of the island branches. They even started to gradually rebuild the passage between the 2 worlds that had been destroyed. In other words, the upper and lower worlds of the destroyed logistics world had bypassed the logistics world layer and directly established a relationship between the upper and lower worlds. If one were to look at it from the perspective of a chain, it would mean that the broken link of the 2 chains that should have been broken was directly discarded, and the remaining complete chain was reconnected, turning into a complete chain that was 1 link shorter than the previous one. The instant the connection was established, the ripples that reverberated between the heavens and earth swiftly calmed down. Not long after, it was as if nothing had happened. The serious consequences that Luo Fan had expected did not appear. The reason for this was obviously because of the close communication between the endless worlds. Because of the close communication between the endless worlds, every island branches and every world had indescribable passages between them. These passages truly formed the endless worlds into one, as if it had turned into a boundless ocean. Under such circumstances, when a part of the ocean suddenly sank and some seawater suddenly disappeared out of thin air, the other parts of the ocean would naturally be filled with endless seawater to support the sunken and missing parts. In this case, this kind of sinking and this kind of loss would naturally disappear very quickly. At this time, for the endless worlds, the destroyed world was equivalent to a part of the ocean suddenly disappearing out of thin air. In this way, the other endless worlds would naturally begin to gather nutrients to fill these gaps and repair the holes here. Of course, this was only a rather crude analogy, and the specific situation was naturally much more subtle and complicated than this. The second point was that although this was the first time such a situation had happened, However, since it had already happened, it meant that from now on, this kind of situation would happen more and more often. This time, Luo Fan had indeed punished them, which could indeed make other cultivators who wanted to do similar things have some scruples. However, when their impulse to destroy broke through this scruple, the destruction that should be caused would eventually still happen. This happened again and again, and in the end, the situation would probably not be much different from before. Unless Luo Fan could be vigilant at all times and nip all the seeds of destruction in the bud, the final outcome would ultimately be the same. Obviously, Luo Fan did not build these island branches and countless worlds to find trouble for himself. He had constructed all of this in preparation for his own cultivation. Under such circumstances, how could he waste his time to protect this boundless world? Since taking action would not have much effect on the outcome of the matter and would instead bring great trouble to himself, making it difficult for him to cultivate, of course, he did not bother to take action. Perhaps this is the reason why this place is recognized by the Tao Master's path. When he stopped planning to take action, such a thought appeared in his mind out of thin air. How could a normal, endless world be indestructible? Even the various natural landscapes of the Tao Master's path, all kinds of worlds, all kinds of space-time, could be destroyed and destroyed. Even the Tao Master's path was like this. How could the island branches and the worlds he had built really be completely indestructible? It could be said that the fact that these island branches could not be completely destroyed and had a final bottom line had already made these island branches fundamentally different from nature. Perhaps the reason why these island branches were not accepted by the Tao Master's path before, and the second tribulation experts cultivated in them, could not directly transcend to the second level of the Tao Master's path. This unnaturalness was also one of the reasons. At this time, Luo Fan suddenly felt that he had some subtle new understanding of cultivation. Faintly, his cultivation realm seemed to have lost some of its charm. Under Luo Fan's indifferent gaze, the destruction of the Salvation Organization was not smooth sailing. As mentioned before, the source of a disaster in the endless world was caused by the different salvation concepts of different salvation organizations. Under such circumstances, any established organization would naturally have a sense of mission to shoulder the life and death of the endless world. Under such a sense of mission, in the face of the organization that directly destroyed the world and the foundation of the endless world, it was self-evident what they would think. In just a moment, this salvation organization was regarded as the real source of the disaster by a large number of other salvation organizations. This was simply equivalent to directly putting a target in front of other organizations. In an instant, all kinds of attacks began to be launched from various organizations, aimed at the Salvation Organization that destroyed the logistics of a certain side. How dare you destroy the world? It seems that you're the source of the disaster. Let's get rid of you first. This was an attack declaration publicly spread by a Salvation Organization. This declaration was the voice of many other Salvation Organizations, and it was also the righteous reason for their attack. Chapter 3149. Although the Salvation Organization that brazenly destroyed the world had expected that their actions would cause great changes, they did not expect the changes to be so intense. For a time, they used all sorts of means to barely withstand the first wave of attacks from the Salvation Organizations. However, the losses far exceeded their imagination. As a result of such losses, their performance in the second, third, and fourth waves of attacks became worse. In the end, the entire Salvation Organization collapsed after 10 waves of attacks, and the leader of the organization was killed. The remaining members received different punishments according to their positions in the organization. The worst punishment was death, and the weakest punishment was sealed. The entire process only took a few hundred years. Compared to this, the Salvation Organization that this Salvation Organization was targeting did not gain any benefits and suffered heavy losses as well. Of course, compared to their original fate of being completely destroyed, they were only damaged now, which could be considered to have gained a lot of benefits. Amidst the waves of attacks, the conflicts between the Salvation Organizations became more and more irreconcilable. After all, there were benefits to splitting up an organization. It was impossible for these benefits to be distributed evenly. Naturally, some organizations would gain more benefits, while others would gain less. This was the source of the conflict. Hence, the cooperation of the many organizations did not ease the atmosphere in the endless world. On the contrary, it made the atmosphere in the endless world even tenser. The siege of the Salvation organizations had a great impact on the environment. Although they still had some scruples in the process and did not completely break through the bottom line of not destroying the world, they did not cause complete destruction to any part of the world. However, in the process, they still caused great damage. Tens of millions of worlds had completely lost their lives because of this war. Apart from the completeness of the world itself, everything else was no different from the destruction of the world. The vitality within, the yuan qi within, the energy within, the laws within, and so on, had all been completely annihilated. If they wanted to restore the vitality of the world, apart from needing a long time, they would also need the help of many external forces. Fortunately, the connection between the endless heavens and earth was very tight. As long as the endless heavens and earth existed as a whole, no matter how thoroughly the endless heavens and earth were destroyed, they could absorb endless nutrient from the other endless heavens and earth to recover bit by bit through this connection. Therefore, even though they looked extremely miserable at this moment, it was only temporary. This siege was like the opening of a Pandora's box, and the intensity of the battles in the endless world suddenly increased by 1,000 times. The battles between the various organizations became more and more intense. In the midst of battle, the world would lose its vitality and be on the verge of destruction. Even the complete destruction of the world, causing a layer of the world on a branch of an island to be completely destroyed, was a common occurrence. The endless world seemed to be shrouded by an indescribable shadow, and the entire world sank into an indescribable pressure and terror. However, this situation did not reduce the number of organizations in the endless world. On the contrary, this kind of oppression, this kind of terror, gave birth to even more organizations. What was the reason for the birth of so many salvation organizations in the past? It was because those who had transcended could sense that the endless heavens and earth had changed, and they had a premonition that an inconceivable disaster would appear in the endless heavens and earth. That was just a premonition, but it had already given birth to so many organizations and brought so many problems. Now that the disaster had already happened and the endless heavens and earth was shrouded in oppression and terror, how could those who had transcended turn a blind eye to it? Naturally, they could only actively band together to deal with this terror and disaster, and could no longer rely on luck to deal with everything like before. And the increase in the number of organizations caused the scale of the conflicts in the endless heavens and earth to become even larger. This further intensified the oppression and terror in the endless heavens and earth. In a conflict between two people, even if it developed to its peak, the biggest possibility was that one or both of them would fall. This kind of intensity was naturally quite intense for both sides. However, compared to the conflict between organizations, this kind of conflict between people was obviously nothing. No matter what, an organization could not have only one person, right? Under normal circumstances, the number of members in an organization should be plural. No matter how small an organization was, a dozen or so members were obviously very few. For such a conflict, even if it was the smallest organization, it would still be a matter of a dozen or so members. In such a conflict, if one or both organizations were to be destroyed at the same time, it would still require the destruction of a dozen or so members, and this was only based on the smallest organization. Under normal circumstances, how could an organization be called an organization only have a dozen or so people? Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people. This was the norm for a normal organization. If there was a conflict between such organizations, how could the scale of the conflict be comparable to a conflict between humans? At this time, in the endless heavens and earth, this kind of situation was even more vivid and vivid. No matter how strong the conflict between the transcended experts was, it was still between two different worlds. And no matter how weak the conflict between the organizations formed by the transcended experts was, it still happened between hundreds or even thousands of worlds. Under such circumstances, the appearance of so many organizations in the endless heavens and earth had a great impact on the chaos in the endless heavens and earth was self-evident. For a time, the intensity of the chaos in the endless heavens and earth skyrocketed, and the pressure and terror that enveloped the endless heavens and earth became more and more intense. This is a tribulation. Luo Fan saw all of this, and he could not help but sigh inwardly. In the beginning, he did not think of this, but as many coincidences appeared and the situation developed in a straight line, no matter how slow he was, he finally realized this point. The world had a tribulation of the world. The chaos layer had a tribulation of the world. The heaven and earth group had a tribulation of the world. The world group had a tribulation of the world. It could be said that as long as an existence was truly recognized by the state of chaos, there would definitely be a tribulation. Ever since Luo Fan had an understanding of the state of chaos and cultivation, all signs pointed to this point. In fact, during his 7th tribulation, he had even come into contact with the chaos layer tribulation that simulated the state of chaos and targeted the transportation network layer that he had built. Although it was only a simulation of the Great Tribulation, it was not a simulation without a foundation. There was definitely a basis for it. In other words, if there was no real chaos layer tribulation in the state of chaos, there would not be such a simulated chaos layer tribulation in the simulated state of chaos. If even the chaos layer was like this, other existences would naturally not be an exception. Therefore, it could not be more normal for endless tribulation to appear in the endless heavens and earth. Of course, there was a precondition for this, and that was for the existence of the state of chaos to be accepted. The endless heavens and earth, or rather, the many branches of the islands, did not directly come into contact with the state of chaos, nor did it receive any recognition from the state of chaos. However, it had clearly been accepted and recognized by the Tao Master's Path. And what was the Tao Master's Path? The Tao Master's Path was built by an eternal, indestructible, omniscient, and omniscient Tao Master. The things built by such an existence had obviously reached the peak in a certain aspect. In other words, the Tao Master's Path, to a certain extent, already possessed the characteristics of the state of chaos. In this way, being accepted and recognized by the Tao Master's Path, to a certain extent, was already recognized by the state of chaos. This was the reason why the endless world would not cause the endless tribulation of heaven and earth. But this time, after he had truly opened the path to the 3rd level of the road to Tao Master, this was the fundamental reason for the arrival of this kind of tribulation. After seeing this clearly, Luo Fan knew that he could only rely on the cultivators in the endless heavens and earth to deal with this tribulation. If he took action, he might be able to completely resolve this tribulation. However, there would also be a serious consequence. The Tao Master's Path would be recognized by the endless heavens and earth, and it would be withdrawn. In that case, it would seem that he had regained control of the endless heavens and earth, as well as the many branches of the islands. However, the potential of the endless heavens and earth would be completely destroyed. Once this happened, even if he completely regained control of the endless heavens and earth, the benefits that he could obtain from it would be greatly reduced. And this was only the effect on him. If he really intervened and the Tao Master's Path was withdrawn, it would also have a very serious impact on the many creatures and transcendence in the endless heavens and earth. It would greatly reduce their potential, and it would also greatly reduce the nutrients that they could obtain from the endless heavens and earth. Once that happened, it would only be a matter of time before the endless heavens and earth completely perished. After all, without nutrients and potential, how could those creatures stay in the endless heavens and earth? Naturally, they would do everything possible to transcend and leave the endless heavens and earth, even if the endless heavens and earth was their home, and even if they were reluctant to leave the endless heavens and earth. But if there was no future here and they could not go further, their feelings for this home would eventually be worn away over the endless years. And once this feeling was worn away, they would naturally not waste any more time staying here. As for how to transcend and leave, there was even less to say. If the Tao Master's path no longer acknowledged and accepted the endless heavens and earth, then it would be impossible for the cultivators here to directly transcend and enter the third level of the Tao Master's path. This seemed to directly cut off their path of transcendence and leaving the endless heavens and earth. But don't forget what the endless heavens and earth's cultivators' path of transcendence was like in the beginning. At that time, they could directly transcend and enter the first level of the Tao Master's path. At that time, the endless heavens and earth had not yet been acknowledged and accepted by the Tao Master's path. Since it had been accepted back then the endless heavens and earth would naturally return to how it was back then if the Tao Master's path withdrew its recognition. In other words, the first level of the Tao Master's path would be open to them again. Therefore, the cultivators here did not need to worry about not being able to find a way out. In the end, the only ones who would suffer would be the endless heavens and earth. When he thought of this, Luo Fan's last bit of intention to take action was completely dispelled. In the end, they still have to rely on themselves. I hope they can react quickly. Luo Fan sighed inwardly and just quietly watched the situation develop in the endless heavens and earth. Compared to Luo Fan, who could directly see the source of the disasters in the endless heavens and earth, those who had transcended in the endless heavens and earth obviously did not have such an ability. Even those experts who had undergone the 6 tribulations could not really see the source of this disaster. After all, their vision had not risen to the level of Luo Fan. Even the disciples of the Tao Masters could only look at one side of the heavens and earth. They knew that there would be tribulations in the heavens and earth, that there would be tribulations for all living beings, and that there would be tribulations for cultivation. But they did not know that there would also be tribulations when so many heavens and earth converged together. Even the experts who had undergone the 6 tribulations were like this, let alone those who had transcended who were not experts who had undergone the 6 tribulations. They could not even imagine the tribulations of the endless heavens and earth. At this time, they only regarded the organizations that had caused the conflicts as the source of the disaster and tried their best to resolve the conflicts. But their efforts had instead become a new source of conflict, causing the conflicts between the endless heavens and earth to become more and more intense and large-scale. In this way, it almost formed an endless cycle, causing the situation in the endless heavens and earth to become worse and worse. In the eyes of those who had transcended, this was an indescribable taste of fate. Moreover, it was an increasingly strong taste of fate. It was as if all their actions and efforts were under the control of fate and were gradually pushing the endless heavens and earth toward an ending that they did not want to see. Chapter 3150. The appearance of the endless tribulation of the heavens and earth was something that no living being had ever encountered before. However, as long as it existed, there would naturally be traces left behind. Even if no one had encountered such a tribulation before, as it continued to develop and more traces of it were left behind in the endless world, the existence of such a tribulation was gradually noticed by the supreme transcendence in the endless world. Not everything required experience to be discovered. Not everything needed to be told before one could know. If that was the case, then how did the first existence to understand certain things understand those things? It was the same for the endless tribulation of the heavens and earth. Although none of the living beings in this boundless world had ever seen such a tribulation, and none of them knew about it from any inheritance. However, through summarizing the various traces left behind by this tribulation and combining it with their own knowledge and guesses, they finally confirmed that this wasn't an ordinary calamity, but a tribulation hundreds of thousands of years after the tribulation erupted. It was a tribulation that targeted every corner of the world, every cultivator, and even every living being. Naturally, the supreme transcendents who first proposed this idea were doubted by many. After all, this idea was too subversive. However, as more and more traces of the tribulation appeared in the endless world, the truth of this idea was verified time and time again. In the end, After this idea appeared for hundreds of years, it was finally acknowledged by all the supreme transcendence. Now that the endless world was in the midst of an unprecedented tribulation, this gradually became common knowledge in the endless world. Knowing this, although the salvation organizations wanted to restrain themselves and stop attacking each other, they did not dare to do so. However, it was a pity that while it was easy to start an attack, it was clearly not so easy to end the conflict and end the attack between the two sides. How could the conflict and enmity that had accumulated over such a long period of time be severed by a simple reason that it was not good for the endless world to continue? Most of the salvation organizations could calm down and choose the best choice for themselves and the endless world. However, as long as a part of the salvation organization was not calm and rational enough, the conflict would never stop. Could all the salvation organizations in the endless world be calm and rational enough to deal with the enmity? How is this possible? Transcendent cultivators were cultivators who could not bear to part with the things they cared about. Such cultivators were clearly more sentimental to begin with. The more emotional they were, the more they couldn't let go of their hatred. Even if the reason they established the organization was to save the world and save the endless world, the situation would obviously become many times more complicated from the moment they established the organization. Perhaps before the establishment of the organization, they would be able to look at everything calmly and rationally. But after the establishment of the organization, the members of the organization would naturally establish a closer relationship with each other, creating a stronger bond. This kind of restraint would affect their rational judgment, making it difficult for them to act from a standpoint of the endless world like before the establishment of the organization. For example, before the organization was established, if a supreme being died, they would at most feel that it was a pity, but they wouldn't feel obligated to avenge him. If his death was beneficial to the peace of the endless heaven and earth, he might even secretly praise his death in his heart. However, if this supreme being became a comrade of the organization, the situation would be completely different. It was impossible for them to remain indifferent to the death of their comrade. In their hearts, they would definitely believe that they had the obligation to avenge their comrade. Even if the death of their comrade was beneficial to the peace of the endless heaven and earth, they would still find it difficult to let go of this enmity. Thus, it was clear that after these organizations were established, things like rationality wouldn't be able to dominate the judgment of the supreme beings who established the organization. Thus, among the numerous organizations, only a small portion of the organizations were truly rational enough to let go of all enmities and would rather keep the peace, making sacrifices for the sake of the endless heaven and earth. Even more organizations knew that their actions would cause the endless heaven and earth tribulation, but they couldn't suppress the hatred in their hearts and continued to attack the enemy organization that had brought great damage to their organization. At most, they would have some plans in their hearts, deciding to cultivate their hearts and minds after the enemy organization was destroyed and contribute to the endless heaven and earth's tribulation. Unfortunately, this was clearly wishful thinking on their part, not to mention the fact that they couldn't easily destroy the enemy organization. Even if they destroyed the enemy organization, would the organizations and supreme beings who were related to the enemy organization be willing to keep the peace and completely let go of their enmity? Obviously, the possibility of that was very small. Once they did that, it wouldn't be up to them whether they could escape or not. Thus, even though the existence of the endless heaven and earth's tribulation had become common knowledge, the battles between the endless heaven and earth didn't decrease much. In fact, due to the fact that the salvation organizations all wanted to end the battle quickly, the intensity of the battle had increased by a lot. The scene was even more chaotic than before they knew about the existence of the endless heaven and earth's tribulation. Luo Fan watched for a while, then sighed and shifted his attention away. He once again guarded his body and merged with the endless heaven and earth, or rather, the grand exchange between the countless islands and the ocean of nothingness outside. The endless heaven and earth was currently in the midst of the endless heaven and earth's tribulation, and it seemed to be many times more chaotic than before, even faintly showing signs of overturning. However, all these changes didn't disrupt the grand exchange between the endless heaven and the ocean of nothingness around it. On the contrary, it seemed that the endless heaven and earth's tribulation was a direct effect of the state of chaos, making the exchange smoother than usual. There were more mysterious existences circulating at every moment than usual. This was obviously of great benefit to Luo Fan. It allowed him to gain more than before in the process of integrating into this kind of communication. For Luo Fan, such a harvest could barely be regarded as a pleasant surprise. In any case, it was impossible for him to interfere with the endless heaven and earth's tribulation. So there was no meaning in focusing his attention on the endless heaven and earth's tribulation. As Luo Fan focused his attention on the grand exchange, time passed bit by bit. In the blink of an eye, tens of millions of years had passed in the endless heaven and earth. After tens of millions of years of development, the endless heaven and earth's tribulation still hadn't faded. On the contrary, it seemed to have become more and more powerful. Back then, the effect of the endless heaven and earth's tribulation was only manifested in the battles between the various organizations. Now, after tens of millions of years, almost every part of the world had fallen into a strange endless heaven and earth's tribulation. Of course, there were still conflicts and fights between those salvation organizations. Not only did they not fade completely, but they were even more intense than before. As for the conflicts and enmity between the organizations, they had reached an irreconcilable state. Although they called themselves the organizations of the world, they didn't even put half of their energy into saving the world and helping the world resist the various endless heaven and earth's strange endless heaven and earth's tribulations. At most, they only put 30% of their energy into saving the worlds. The lesser amount was only for show, and they didn't even put 10% of their energy into saving the world. Most of their energy was spent on attacking each other. After tens of millions of years of fighting, the accumulated enmity between the organizations was so deep that it could not be washed away even with all the water in the world. The enmity itself was enough to distort the minds of the members of the organizations. Not to mention the fact that the endless tribulations of the heavens and earth were subtly guiding and influencing them from behind the scenes, making the enmity even harder to wash away, making the conflict between them even harder to eliminate, and making it even harder to reconcile. That was why the current situation was like this. Why has it developed to this stage? It's already been tens of millions of years. Why hasn't the endless heaven and earth's tribulation passed? In a certain world, two familiar transcendents were conversing. These two transcendents were the ones who had persuaded each other to give up on the idea of transcending and leaving the endless heaven and earth. The one who spoke was one of them. "Do you regret staying?" the other asked with a sigh. When they had decided to stay, the endless heaven and earth had been completely different. Back then, although the endless heaven and earth had not been without tribulations, the endless heaven and earth's tribulations had only stopped in one part of the world. The overall situation had been calm and peaceful. That endless heaven and earth had obviously made people happy. But now, the boundless heavens and the earth were completely different. Presently, there were battles everywhere, chaos everywhere, and tribulations everywhere. There was slaughter, death, and destruction everywhere at all times. Just listening to such a place was enough to make people feel irritated, let alone being in it. It could be said that the endless heaven and earth before them and the endless heaven and earth they had wanted to see were two extremes. Under such circumstances, if one of them suspected the other would regret it. This was not even a real suspicion, but a simple judgment. No, I don't regret it. On the contrary, I'm glad that I chose to stay. The first supreme, transcendent side. Although there was a tinge of pain in his expression, there was more joy in it. Obviously, just as he had said, he was glad that he had not chosen to transcend and leave the endless heaven and earth. Instead, he had chosen to stay here. Why? The other person asked curiously. To be honest, he also regretted not transcending and leaving the endless heaven and earth. Over the years, there had been many times when he had the urge to transcend and leave. However, due to various reasons, he had suppressed these urges in the end. Because if I transcend and leave, everything I care about might have already been destroyed in this tribulation. That transcendent expert let out a long sigh, and an indescribable sorrow appeared on his face. His words caused the expression of the other transcendent to change slightly. Then he smiled bitterly. Indeed, it seems that I can't let go of my world. The reason why he had suppressed the urge to transcend time and time again was because of all sorts of strange reasons. It was as if he had been hindered by trivial matters time and time again, making it difficult for him to let go of everything and transcend. Previously, he had not seriously thought about it. He had only felt that there were too many things and that there were too many changes, making him unable to truly feel at ease. However, now that the other party had explained it to him, he understood that the reason why he could not transcend and leave the endless heaven and earth was not because of those trivial matters. There was only one reason that had truly made him give up on the idea of transcending. It was the foundation of his transcendence. Because he could not let go of his world, because he was worried that his world and his people would suffer misfortune after he left, he had suppressed the urge to transcend time and time again. He had chosen to stay in the endless heaven and earth, choosing to continue protecting his world. Even though he felt annoyed at the endless heaven and earth that had fallen into chaos, even though the endless heaven and earth's cultivators disappointed him, he did not change his mind. In fact, this kind of mentality could be inferred to the many transcendents who had remained in the endless heaven and earth. Among them, there were very few who truly felt that the situation in the endless heaven and earth satisfied their own interests and what they desired to see. Most of the transcendents were like these two and felt that the situation in the endless heaven and earth disappointed them. But even so, there were still a majority of them that remained in this endless world. The reason for this was clearly similar to those two existences that had transcended. It was because they couldn't bear to part with their own world and their own people. Love for oneself, love for one's home, love for one's country. This was the mentality of a normal person, and it was the same for cultivators. Even if a cultivator became a transcendent, there would not be any fundamental change. The most fundamental reason for the transcendents to be reluctant to leave the endless heaven and earth was their world and their people. Chapter 31:51. Their love for their own world and their reluctance to part with their own people was the fundamental reason why so many transcendents had given up on transcending and left the endless world. Therefore, although the endless world was in a chaotic and oppressive state, making it difficult for them to have a good impression of it, most of them still stayed. Of course, although they had stayed in the endless world for the sake of their own world and their own people, it did not mean that they were resigned to the situation in the endless world. In fact, during the long, endless world's tribulations, the transcendents were still working hard to find a way to help the endless world's tribulations. Of course, they were well aware of the results of the Salvation Organization's actions. Therefore, the efforts of the remaining transcendents to overcome the endless tribulations of the world were mostly only at the planning stage. Very few of them actually took action. As the endless world's tribulations continued to develop, they gradually came to understand some of the characteristics of the endless world's tribulations. They understood that if they did not grasp the key to the endless world's tribulations, all their efforts would only be used by the endless world's tribulations. In the end, they would become the driving force for the endless world's tribulations. That was why they made such a decision. The longer the endless world's tribulations lasted, the more power they displayed, and the easier it would be to see through their roots. It was clear that the endless world's tribulations had lasted for tens of millions of years. By any standard, the endless world's tribulations could not be considered short. After such a long time, even if the endless world's tribulations were extremely obscure and profound, even if it was the first time the transcendents had come into contact with the endless world tribulations, they were still able to see through the traces left behind by the endless world tribulations and see the essence of the endless world's tribulations. Although the endless world's tribulations were still oppressive, filled with destruction, and filled with slaughter, The situation in some heavens and earths was gradually changing. The endless world's tribulations that had yet to subside gradually calmed down. Due to some inexplicable mechanism, those heavens and earths received some sort of indescribable blessing, causing the endless world's tribulations to improve. The appearance of this situation was like a subtle, clear stream flowing into the endless world. Although it was not enough to completely free the endless world from the endless world's tribulations, it gave the despairing endless world a glimmer of hope. A rare glimmer of hope. You found a way. When that happened, a stream of inquiries and information surged from all over the world to the rulers who had helped their own world through the tribulations. Or, to say, the transcendents. They were all people who had transcended the world, who didn't know each other. No matter how slow-witted a transcendent being was, after being trapped in this endless tribulation for so many years, he would definitely have a deep understanding of the situation in this endless world. For them, the world's tribulations were endless world's tribulations. Water had a different attitude. Although they wanted to save the world, they were using a more restrained method to find a more appropriate solution. Even if they couldn't explain it clearly, they had a rough idea long ago. Endless worlds to worlds up, and for to be, and with God for the world. In worlds, so for the world. To be. For with. For the world's transcendents who were worried that the endless world would be destroyed in the tribulations and wanted to help the endless world, how could they let this chance go? Even if the world's transcendents who had succeeded in world's tribulations were quite different from what they had imagined, even if the logic behind those transcendents differed greatly from their own, it was their greatest hope in this desperate moment. Of course, there were naturally transcendents who held on to their own ideals and continued to explore. But in the end, they were only a minority of the group. The consequences of the conflicts between the different ideals of the Salvation organizations were the best evidence. The Salvation Organization's performance over the past tens of millions of years was the best evidence. With such evidence, the world's transcendents who were still rational and had not lost their rationality, because of the conflicts, would naturally be more restrained. They could search for solutions by themselves, but to truly save the endless world was not something they could do alone. That was why the world's transcendents, who had successfully helped their world escape the tribulations, had no intention of keeping the methods they had discovered secret. They had directly integrated the methods they had discovered into the communication between the endless world, and through this communication, the information had been transmitted to every part of the endless world. Whether it was the Salvation organizations that had become a part of the endless world's tribulations or the world's transcendents who had restrained themselves and only focused on finding solutions, the world's transcendents who had not participated in the conflict all received this information at the same time. As this information was publicized to all the world's transcendents, the situation in the endless world's tribulations changed slightly. Although it was still oppressive, the world's tribulations that had erupted endlessly in every part of the endless world's tribulations gradually calmed down. In just a few short years, the world's tribulations that had yet to calm down had been reduced by almost 90%. Due to the efforts of almost all the world's transcendents, most of the worlds had barely escaped the tribulations. In fact, because they had escaped the tribulations, they had even received some sort of subtle feedback from an indescribable existence in the outside world, which had greatly benefited those worlds. Every aspect had more or less improved. Looks like the first wave has passed. Somewhere, a world's transcendent let out a long breath, and his expression relaxed a little. However, he had only relaxed a little. There was still a long way to go before he could completely relax. After all, the tribulations had only affected about 90% of the world's tribulations. There were still 10% of the world's tribulations that were still affected due to various reasons. Just the conflict between the world's tribulations that had become irreconcilable due to the endless world's tribulations had not eased at all compared to before. Under such circumstances, although a large number of worlds had escaped the tribulation's influence and seemed to have obtained freedom and safety, in reality, this was only one aspect of resolving the tribulations. The true focus of the tribulations was not much different from before. How could the world's transcendence, who clearly knew the truth, truly relax? How could the world's transcendence, who clearly knew the truth, truly relax? I have to think of a way. This is already the best chance. If I miss it, I don't know when I'll get another chance like this. The world's transcendence thought to himself with an indescribable urgency. This was the best chance to resolve the irreconcilable conflicts between the world's tribulations. Because in order to save their own world, in order to save their own people, those who had transcended had forcefully broken free from the control of the endless tribulations of the world, pouring almost all of their energy into the huge project of helping their own world. Although they had not completely broken free from the endless world's tribulations' influence, they had at least regained their rationality and were now able to communicate. As the crisis of their worlds passed, the influence of their worlds and their people on their minds naturally began to dissipate. If this continued, it wouldn't be long before their rationality was once again controlled by the endless world's tribulations. They would once again fall into their previous state and find it difficult to communicate. Therefore, to truly resolve the conflict between them, they could only take advantage of the time when they could still communicate. If they missed this time, they could only wait for the next time when they could communicate. Obviously, the appearance of such a moment was hard to control. Perhaps it would happen again and again in the future, but it was also possible that this would be the last time. If he missed this chance, he would never be able to encounter such a moment and the same opportunity again. I believe that all of you know the current situation. If we don't take action now, we will all lose this home. The world's transcendence transmitted his thoughts to the other worlds through the subtle communication between the endless worlds. As his thoughts spread, one transcendent expert after another who was still calm echoed his sentiments, spreading the same or similar words throughout the boundless world. Through this transmission of information, it gathered into an indescribable tide that began to wash over the endless worlds like a real tide. At the same time, it also washed over the minds of the transcendents who were gradually falling back into the endless world's tribulations control. The nature of one person saying something and countless people saying the same thing at the same time were completely different. When someone spoke alone, no matter how reasonable his words were, not many people would truly listen to him unless his words had been proven to be correct time and time again. Moreover, this person's words could be guaranteed to be heard by others. And if countless people said the same thing at the same time, then, even if the sentence was very stupid, as long as anyone calmly thought about it, they would be able to tell that the sentence was nonsense, that it was taken for granted, that it was a grave mistake, and that it was unbelievably persuasive. This kind of thing had happened too many times in the mortal world. Many people had made decisions that they couldn't understand in hindsight. At the transcendence level, this situation was no exception. Although it was more difficult for transcendents to achieve the same effect compared to ordinary people, it was only a difference in methods. There wasn't much difference in essence. At this time, the words of the transcendents had clearly formed a similar effect. Finally, it gathered into an indescribable persuasive force, causing the transcendents who were gradually immersed in the hatred between the world's tribulations to calm down. Of course, this calmness was still rather limited. They couldn't let go of the hatred between the world tribulations just because of these words. They couldn't forget the harm that the world's tribulations had done to their loved ones and the endless worlds. If they didn't take the next step, it wouldn't be long before they would once again fall into that indescribable state. They would once again be controlled by the endless world's tribulations and become one of the forces pushing the endless worlds towards the abyss of destruction. Your fight can continue, but it can't continue in the endless worlds. We can create a world for you to fight to your heart's content. One of the transcendents hurriedly said. His words instantly received the approval of many transcendents. Of course, the first batch to respond to this suggestion wouldn't be the transcendents of the World Salvation Organizations. The first batch to respond would obviously be the transcendents who had always maintained their calm and secretly searched for a way to save the world. Although they each had their own thoughts and arrangements for those salvation organizations, it was clear that due to the precedence of those salvation organizations, they also knew that if there was a conflict between these different methods, they would clearly follow in their footsteps. It would only bring chaos to the endless world. Thus, they already had a tacit understanding at this time. They were rushing to answer to decide on a way to save the world. In other words, as long as the first method was reasonable, they would agree with it no matter what methods they had or what more exquisite methods they had. This wasn't a mutual agreement, but it was a tacit understanding. At this time, constructing a world to become the battlefield for the world's salvation organizations was clearly a method to benefit from this tacit understanding. Just like what had been said before, when a phrase was repeated by countless people, it would be unimaginably persuasive. It was the same for such a suggestion at this time. The fact that countless transcendents said the same thing at the same time made the persuasiveness of this method unimaginable. Chapter 31:52. For those who had transcended, opening up a world was an ordinary matter. After all, even the weakest transcendent could nurture a small world that they had brought with them into a complete world. As for those who had transcended, they were like experts who had undergone 6 tribulations, working hard for their island branches for a long time. In other words, they had opened up an unknown number of worlds. For such existences, opening up a world was naturally not difficult at all. Thus, the difficulty of the many transcendent experts working together to open up a world was to unify everyone's goal and not how to accomplish it. And at this time, with the many transcendent experts working together to open up a world to serve as the battlefield for the salvation organizations, the process of unifying their goal was naturally completed. Of course, this did not mean that what they were about to do next would come naturally. After all, the world they were working together to open up wasn't the kind that could exist in the void and become a new layer of the island branches. Instead, it had to be a world that could endure the struggles of the salvation organizations. Naturally, the construction of such a world was many times more difficult than an ordinary one. Thus, after the many transcendent experts had come to a consensus, many streams of information quickly flowed back and forth between the many worlds. The first thing to be determined was the location of the battlefield. This was also a point that was extremely likely to cause a conflict. However, it was clear that the current situation was extremely different from before. At the very least, the transcendent expert who had opened up the battlefield clearly had a certain level of authority in this regard. After all, he was the one who had proposed this, so he naturally had more considerations about the location of the battlefield. This was something that the other transcendent experts agreed with. Hence, this point that was enough to trigger a conflict passed peacefully. And the final location of the battlefield was in the boundless world, in the region with the highest concentration of the transcendent experts. The distribution of the transcendent experts was uneven. After all, there were no specific rules that dictated where the transcendent experts would appear or how they would be distributed. Under such circumstances, the distribution of the transcendent experts was naturally random. And random naturally meant that there was an imbalance. And if there was an imbalance, there would be places where the transcendent experts were concentrated and places where they were sparse. Of course, the difference between density and sparseness wasn't huge. However, no matter how big it was, there was still a difference. Since there was a difference, it could become a standard. This was the place with the densest concentration of transcending experts in the world. Originally, there was nothing special about this place. In the boundless world, it was just a seemingly ordinary place. However, once it was determined to be the location of the battlefield, it had unknowingly become the center of the boundless world. From the perspective of the island branch, there was nothing special about this location. The void ocean layer where the island branch was located was also an ordinary void ocean layer in the endless void ocean layer. It could be said that the reason it had become the place where the battlefield had been established was entirely due to luck. After confirming the location of the battlefield, the next step was to design the world. This step was also the most important step in the entire process. As for the rest, no matter how good the location of the heaven and earth was, no matter how well the process of establishing the heaven and earth was done, As long as the design of this step was not perfect, everything would be in vain. And this step was also the crux of the debate. Many transcending experts had their own ideas, and each of them believed that their ideas were the most perfect. However, these different ideas would naturally conflict, and vaguely, they would become another source of conflict. Fortunately, many transcending experts knew that they were already in the midst of the boundless world's tribulation. Their thoughts, their wills, and their wills were all likely to be affected by the endless world's tribulation. Therefore, at this time, when faced with this possible source of conflict, they immediately reacted to the risks involved. Thus, they used the fastest speed possible to nip this conflict in the bud. This can't go on. There needs to be someone to unify everyone's opinions. A transcending expert directly transmitted this information to the boundless world, into the hearts of all transcending experts. Although deep in their hearts, they weren't very satisfied with this. In order to prevent the conflict from erupting again and to prevent themselves from being controlled by the endless world's tribulation, they could only make this choice. However, they could only choose such a choice. Although they were not satisfied with it, they could still reluctantly accept it. As for the existence that had unified everyone's opinions, it was obvious that it was the transcendent who had suggested this method and confirmed the location of the battlefield. This transcending expert was originally a very ordinary transcending expert who could be considered to have blended into the crowd. However, this time, because of this suggestion, he had unknowingly obtained this kind of authority under the influence of the circumstances. From then on, he stood out from the crowd and was no longer the same as the other transcending experts. It could be said that this could be considered a hero created by the times. At this time, a heavy pressure pressed down on the heart of this transcending expert, making him feel that he had an incomparably great responsibility. However, he didn't dare to directly take out his ideas. As the one who had proposed this idea, he naturally had his own ideas on how to open up the battlefield. However, his ideas weren't perfect either. This was something that was inevitable. If he could come up with a perfect plan, how could he have been blended into the crowd? He would have stood out from all sorts of other opportunities. Although he didn't dare to say that he was above everyone else, he definitely wouldn't be as ordinary as before. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't be willing to give up on such an imperfect plan. After all, no matter how imperfect it was still a design that he had painstakingly conceived. To him, such a design was like his own child. Even if their own children were not smart, who would despise their own children because of this? Who wouldn't give up on their child when they saw an opportunity? Under such circumstances, he would definitely do his best to argue and refute the other transcending experts. He would do his best to make his design the final one. However, it was clear that the current situation was different. Right now, the others had completely given up on their authority to decide and handed the final decision over to him. This was simply akin to handing over the life and death of the boundless world to him. That kind of pressure was unspeakable. It was as if an ordinary person suddenly had to decide the life and death of an entire country. Under such circumstances, how bold would an existence have to be to dare to hand over such a crucial task to his child, just because his child was qualified to bear such a heavy responsibility? No matter how selfish an existence was, before making such a decision, they would have to carefully weigh whether it was worth it or not, right? This was true for ordinary people, and it wasn't much different for these transcending experts. The only difference was that these transcending experts were more rational, more intelligent, and more decisive than ordinary people. Thus, at this time, the transcendent who had been pushed forward to make the final decision could only endure the pain and put aside his own designs, working hard to integrate the billions of designs that the other transcendents had put forward. When he truly put his heart and soul into those designs, this transcending expert would truly understand how extraordinary the other transcending experts were. Different transcending experts had different worldviews. Of course, they all walked the righteous path and didn't truly organize their unique worldviews. They only organized some specific concepts that belonged to their own worldviews. This different worldview caused their designs of the world to be different. Moreover, it was unavoidable that there were also different concepts that belonged to them. These concepts were about heaven and earth, all things, all living beings, the universe, the primal chaos, and everything else. If such a concept appeared alone, it would only make the transcending expert feel offended and want to refute it. However, when there were hundreds of millions of people with such opinions, the situation was obviously completely different. It was as if there were mirrors placed around him from different angles, and each mirror reflected his own appearance from different angles. Because of this naturally made the transcendent's understanding of himself clearer and even more profound. Clearly, this was not a small opportunity for this transcendent being. His understanding of himself became clearer and more profound, which was enough for him to improve his realm. Of course, this wasn't an instantaneous change. It wasn't something that could immediately improve his cultivation realm just by experiencing and studying it. Instead, he had to wait until he had enough time to digest these gains and turn them into his own concepts. Only then would he be able to turn them into the true driving force for his realm improvement. At this time, the greatest benefit for this transcendent was that he gradually understood what kind of design he should come up with to serve as the design for the battlefield. Although he seemed to have put his own world aside, the final design he came up with was still based on his own design of the battlefield. After all, this design was the amalgamation of all his inspirations and was the product that best suited his worldview. Although he knew that it wasn't perfect and that it would easily collapse halfway if he used it directly, it was still a design derived from his own worldview. Such a design determined the criteria for his choice of other designs. In the end, a large part of the design of the battlefield that he integrated was naturally chosen from his own design. Of course, after all, it was a design plan that had integrated countless other battlefields. This final design was countless times more perfect than the original design he had come up with. Perhaps because of his own worldview, this design wasn't the best combination of all the other designs, but it was already above the standard and was enough to be used. As a transcending expert, the speed of his thinking was self-evident. Although it was a massive project to integrate hundreds of millions of designs, only a few breaths had passed by the time the final result was out. In such a short time, the Salvation organizations could clearly endure it. The situation of the endless world wouldn't change because of this. This is my integrated design. I hope that everyone will act as soon as possible. The transcending expert transmitted his design, along with these words, to the hearts of all the transcending experts in the endless world. Naturally, it was impossible for all the supreme transcendents to be satisfied with this design. In fact, it could even be said that no supreme transcendents were truly satisfied with it. However, none of the supreme transcendents felt that this was unacceptable. In other words, none of them felt that this design was perfect, but everyone felt that it was passable. Clearly, at this time, it was enough for everyone to feel that it was a passable design. As a result, boundless energy began to erupt from the endless heaven and earth, and through various indescribable paths and channels, it headed towards the location of the battlefield that they had chosen. Every transcendent was an existence that could single-handedly create a world. At this time, it was unknown how many billions of transcendent beings had sent their power according to the blueprint. Although the sum of their power wasn't as terrifying as billions of worlds, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that there were billions of worlds. A huge figure appeared at the location of the battlefield. Its hands were raised high, and there was a huge phantom above them. This phantom was incomparably mysterious and complex. It felt like an incomparably vast world. At this moment, the power that had gathered from an endless world was like rivers flowing into the sea. It directly surged into the illusory world and continued to merge with it. It became a part of the illusory world and gradually filled up the illusory world. As more and more power poured in, the phantom became more and more solid. It felt like it was gradually turning illusory into reality. Chapter 31:54. This battlefield was still in its embryonic form, just a silhouette. In order to become a complete world, it needed to grow, evolve, balance, and adjust itself. It could be said that this battlefield was just a framework. What kind of world it would eventually become and what kind of appearance it would have would depend on how it would evolve. Perhaps its final appearance would be similar to the original heaven and earth design, or perhaps it would be completely different from the original heaven and earth design. None of this was certain. At this time, the members of the Salvation Organization had entered the battlefield. Their intentions were clear. They clearly intended to participate in the evolution, self-balance, self-adjustment, and self-growth process of the world. At the very least, he had to allow himself to be completely accepted by the battlefield and become a part of the battlefield. The best-case scenario was for the battlefield to evolve according to their ideas and create some elements that were most suitable for them. None of these supreme transcendents were stupid. If one of them had such an idea, the others would naturally follow suit. At this time, they rushed into the battlefield and began to exert their own means to the best of their ability. They used their own will, their own power, their own perception, their own mystiques, their own might, and even everything else to influence and change everything around them. If it was only one supreme transcendent, then this plan might have a chance of success. Even if they couldn't completely change the world according to their ideas, they would still be able to slightly influence it and give it some characteristics that belong to them. However, it was clear that it wasn't just one supreme transcendent who had entered the battlefield. Right now, there were at least hundreds of millions of transcendents who had stepped into the battlefield. With so many supreme transcendents, each of them was using the same method to influence the evolving battlefield. In the end, the evolution of the battlefield became incomparably chaotic. It was as if every supreme transcendent expert had changed the evolution process of the battlefield, but none of them had truly changed the battlefield into what they wanted. In the end, the appearance of the battlefield seemed to contain the traces of all the transcendents in this world, but there was no trace of them at all. Everything seemed specious and confusing. In the end, when the battlefield took shape, it was no longer similar to the design shown in the blueprint. All similarities had changed due to the influence of the numerous transcendents, becoming a completely different and distorted form than before. Apart from this, it was also the most crucial reason why this battlefield world was called a battlefield world. That was the degree of stability of this world. The degree of stability. As a battlefield that could accommodate all the transcendent experts of the world, its endurance was naturally of the utmost importance. If one's endurance was not strong enough, just a little bit of power would cause the world to collapse. Everyone would have to leave this world. In that case, how could this world become a battlefield? What used to have? The most obvious manifestation of the endurance of the battlefield was the stability of the world. What was stable was space, rules, laws, the great Tao, and so on. What was stable were space-time, dimensions, planes, karma, fate, and so on. This kind of stability had to be at least at the level of being able to withstand the battle of the three tribulations in order to barely meet the requirements. And in the best case, it had to be at the level of being able to withstand the battle of the six tribulations. After all, there were many six tribulations among the supreme transcendents. Compared to the supreme transcendents below the three tribulations, their thoughts were more rational, and their battles were naturally limited to the six tribulations. But in the end, it was still a battle, and they still needed to enter the battlefield. However, it was a pity that it was not easy to create a world that could withstand the battle between six tribulation powerhouses. Even if millions of supreme transcendents worked together, it would still be impossible. As a result, in the end, the world they created was only able to withstand a battle between cultivators who had undergone the fourth tribulation. From a certain point of view, this was already an incredible achievement. From the endurance of the battlefield, it was enough to show how extraordinary the supreme transcendents were. In fact, the stability of this battlefield was already much stronger than the other greater heavens and realms. Of course, this did not mean that the quality of the battlefield was better than that of the larger worlds. In fact, it did not mean that the battlefield's endurance was higher than that of the larger worlds. The reason for this judgment was not complicated. because the strength of the larger world was all round, and it was a balanced, perfect strength. Although the degree of stability and stability were the most important indicators of endurance, it was clear that these two were not the only indicators. There were countless factors related to the endurance of the world. For example, the degree of perfection of the laws, the tolerance of the great Tao, the variety of the world's yuan qi, and so on were all closely related to the endurance of the world. Although the stability and stability of a large world couldn't compare to the battlefield world, it was countless times stronger than the battlefield world in terms of other factors that were related to its endurance. So, in terms of endurance, it was many times stronger than the battlefield. Perhaps even a battle between true sages could be withstood by the vast world, of course, because of the different factors. The endurance of the battlefield was completely different from the battlefield. In the battlefield, the destructive force within its endurance range was unable to shake the space-time, laws, the great Tao, and many other aspects of the world. If it couldn't even shake the space-time, then it was naturally impossible to destroy everything. In comparison, the larger world was completely different. Because its endurance wasn't based on the degree of stability and stability, the space-time, laws, and the like weren't difficult to affect in the larger world. It could even be said that so long as the destructive force slightly reached a certain standard, it would be sufficient to destroy space-time. However, because of the influence of many other factors, even if these aspects were destroyed, the nature of the larger world wouldn't be affected much. Even if space-time was destroyed, it would only be equivalent to a small wound on the skin of a larger world. It would either recover completely in a short period of time, or it would completely treat the destroyed scene as a new natural landscape. Compared to the two, the battlefield was like an oyster with a shell growing on it. On the other hand, the larger world was like an incomparably strong martial artist. The shell of an oyster was obviously very hard, and it was even 100 times harder than the skin of a martial artist. However, the gap between an oyster and a martial artist was as huge as the distance between heaven and earth. A martial artist was powerful in all aspects. Even if their skin wasn't as hard as the shell of an oyster, their nature was still countless times stronger than that of an oyster. If they really had the ability, they would naturally open up a larger world to serve as the perfect battlefield for those salvation organizations. However, even a true saint couldn't accomplish something like opening up a larger world in one go. They had to first open up a perfect world and then let the perfect world go through 9 tribulations before they could truly obtain a larger world. Among these supreme transcendents, the strongest was only a 6th tribulation powerhouse. They were still millions and millions of miles away from the true saint realm. So how could they do this? From a certain perspective, they could think of increasing the stability of the world to the extreme, to the point where it could withstand the battle of the supreme transcendence. This was already pushing their abilities to the limit. At this time, as the battlefield took shape, the supreme transcendence began to use all sorts of methods to investigate this world in order to find the arrangements they had made in the previous world. It was obvious that their search was destined to be disappointing. The arrangements of the supreme transcendence interfered with each other, and the final result was that none of their arrangements could be preserved. However, even though they couldn't find his various arrangements, the supreme transcendents weren't too disappointed because of this. Although their own arrangements weren't preserved, the other supreme transcendents arrangements weren't preserved either. In this case, the situation wasn't perfect, but it wasn't too bad either. In fact, this had already reached the bottom line of the supreme transcendence. If they could really preserve their own arrangements, and if they could really rely on these arrangements to defeat many enemies and hostile organizations, they would instead suspect that there was something wrong with it. On the contrary, although the current situation was somewhat disappointing, it showed that their judgment of the development of the situation was correct. Their understanding of the battlefield wasn't too far off. From this point of view, the situation could be considered quite perfect. The stability of space and time is sufficient. The supreme transcendents began to use their own methods to test the endurance of the world. After a series of tests, they felt rather complicated. Originally, as tribulation experts, regardless of whether they were tribulation experts, second or third tribulation experts, the world was extremely fragile to them. As long as they wanted to, not to mention breaking through space-time, it wouldn't be difficult for them to destroy the world. But now, in this world, they discovered that even if they used their full strength, they could at most create some cracks in space-time. Not to mention completely destroying the space-time continuum. Even if he wanted to create a bigger crack, he wouldn't be able to do it. How could these supreme transcendents, who were used to destroying the world, not feel the slightest bit disappointed by this disparity in effect? However, their rationality told them that only such a space-time could withstand the battle between them. If they didn't have this kind of strength, the space-time that was like a normal world would be meaningless for them to fight. Because that kind of time and space was a test of their ability to control their power and not a test of their true strength. In such a normal world, they had to be extremely careful and cautious with their attacks. If they use a little more strength, their strength would be wasted due to the collapse of space-time. And this level of strength couldn't even shake their opponents, let alone injure them. And if they couldn't even injure their opponents, what was the point of fighting? Was it just a game? In comparison, the current situation on the battlefield was clearly different. In this battlefield, even if they used their full strength, they couldn't truly destroy the space-time of this world. Because of this, they could naturally use their full strength in this world, and they could naturally injure each other. This kind of battle could naturally continue, of course, even though they had confirmed that this battlefield was strong enough to withstand their battle. These supreme transcendents did not immediately start fighting. It wasn't because they had worked together before that their conflict had eased, but because they knew that in this strange world, if they didn't familiarize themselves with it, the extent of their strength would be relatively limited. And it was hard to say how much of a threat they could bring to their opponents with their limited strength. It was even to the extent that attacking under the circumstances that one wasn't familiar with the effects of one's own techniques on the battlefield might cause one to reveal flaws that one didn't have in the first place and allow one to reveal flaws that one shouldn't have. If that was the case, they might be digging their own graves if they weren't careful. All the supreme transcendents were clear about this. Under such circumstances, how could they not familiarize themselves with this world? How could they hastily fight with their enemies? The real battle would only begin hundreds of years after this battlefield was formed.